Caleb Whitmore dropped the papers on Ethan Wilder's table like a man throwing bones to a dog. "Sign it," he said, "or I'll have the sheriff padlock this place before Sunday." He didn't sit. Men like Whitmore never sat in houses like Ethan's. Too much dirt, too little worth. He just stood there in his pressed coat and his silver watch chain, looking around the room the way a man looks at something he's already decided to throw away. The single lantern on the table made his shadow stretch long across the wall, and Ethan watched that shadow like it was the more honest version of the man. "There's another option." Whitmore's voice carried the particular ease of someone who had never once lost. "Marry the Beaumont woman, Clara. You know who I mean." Ethan knew. Everybody in Harding County knew. "You do that," Whitmore continued, "and I'll restructure the debt. Give you 18 months. He picked up his hat from the chair where he'd set it, turned it slowly in his hands. "Of course, if you'd rather keep your pride and lose the land, that's your business." He left without waiting for an answer, because men like Whitmore already knew what desperate men would do. Outside, the Wyoming wind hit the walls of the ranch house and found every gap between the boards, and Ethan sat alone in the cold with the papers in front of him and his dead father's land all around him, and no good choices anywhere in sight. If you've ever stood at a crossroads with nothing but bad options in both directions, then you already know something about Ethan Wilder. And if you've ever been the person a whole town decided wasn't worth much, then you know something about Clara Beaumont. This is their story, and I promise you, it is nothing like what anyone expected. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the stories we tell every week. Hit the like button if you want more, and drop a comment below with the city or country where you're watching. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1888, and the marriage nobody wanted. Ethan Wilder was 34 years old and already looked 10 years past it. That wasn't self-pity talking. It was just the arithmetic of frontier life. 6 years of working the Wilder ranch alone after his father's stroke, 4 years of drought that didn't so much end as pause, 2 bad cattle seasons in a row, and 1 winter that killed 11 of his best animals before February even finished with him. The land was his. His father had homesteaded it, proved it up, and handed it to Ethan with shaking hands and 2 words that sounded more like an apology than a blessing. Hold on. Ethan had tried. The debt to Whitmore Lending had started as a bridge loan, $200 to replace a collapsed irrigation channel. Reasonable terms, or so the contract had looked when Ethan signed it. He hadn't been a stupid man, just an exhausted one, and there was a difference. But the payments had a way of growing, and the interest had a way of compounding in directions he hadn't anticipated. And every time he'd gone to the Whitmore office to ask about the figures, the clerk there, a thin young man who never looked directly at you, would show him a column of numbers that always added up to more than Ethan remembered owing. Now it was $840, and Ethan might as well have owed $8,000. He'd gone to the Harding County Bank the previous spring. The banker, a man named Aldrich, who wore wire spectacles and spoke in full, careful sentences, had listened politely and then told Ethan, equally politely, that his property had been used as collateral in the Whitmore loan, and the bank could not extend additional credit against an already encumbered asset. He'd said it like it was nothing personal. Maybe it wasn't. That almost made it worse. So when Whitmore had showed up on his porch that Tuesday evening with his silver watch chain and his pressed coat and his casually devastating proposal, Ethan hadn't thrown him off the property. He'd listened. Because a drowning man doesn't argue with the rope. He grabs it and figures out later who's holding the other end. He sat at the table after Whitmore left and read the papers twice through, slow and careful, the way his father had taught him to read anything with a signature line. The restructuring offer was real enough. 18 months of reduced payments, the debt reframed as a longer installment. It was almost generous if you didn't think too hard about what it was attached to. Marry Clara Beaumont. He said it out loud to the empty room just to hear how it sounded. It sounded exactly as strange out loud as it did in his head. He knew Clara the way everyone in Harding County knew her, which was to say, by reputation and rumor rather than actual acquaintance. She was 30 years old. She'd come to Harding County 6 years ago from somewhere east, some cousin of the Beaumont family who'd taken her in when her own parents died, and she'd been a fixed point of town cruelty ever since. Not because she'd done anything. That was the particular ugliness of it. She hadn't done a single thing except be a large woman who didn't pretend to be sorry about it, and the town had decided that was unforgivable. He'd seen her twice, maybe 3 times, always at a distance. Once at the general store, once at the edge of the Founders' Day celebration, where she'd stood alone near the wagon line, watching the dancing with an expression he hadn't been able to read from where he was standing. The 3rd time was the one that stuck. She'd been walking down the main street of Dunn's Creek carrying a stack of ledger books that had to weigh 20 pounds. And 2 of the Harker boys, grown men, both of them old enough to be past that kind of behavior, had called something out to her from across the street. He couldn't hear what they said, but he saw her face in the half-second before she controlled it. A flash of something, there and gone, like a door opened and then closed. Then she'd walked on like nothing happened. He'd thought about that face, that door flash, more times than he would have admitted to anyone. Clara Beaumont. Whitmore wanted him to marry Clara Beaumont. He turned the lamp down low and sat in the dark for a long time. And what he thought about wasn't the debt, and wasn't the ranch, and wasn't even Whitmore. He thought about what it meant that a man like Whitmore had chosen this particular arrangement, because Whitmore didn't do anything without a reason, and the reason wasn't charity. He was setting something up, some kind of amusement or some kind of outcome he'd already calculated. Men like Whitmore gambled with other people's lives the way gamblers played cards, always knowing more than the other players at the table, always waiting for the hand to play out the way they'd decided it would. The question was what outcome Whitmore had decided on, and whether there was any way to give him a different one. Ethan slept poorly that night and went to see Clara Beaumont the next morning. Boats. She lived at the edge of the Beaumont property in a small house that had originally been a foreman's quarters, set apart from the main house where her cousin Margaret Beaumont lived with her husband. The arrangement had a particular flavor to it, not hostile exactly, but clear. Margaret had taken Clara in out of obligation rather than affection, and the foreman's quarters made the terms of that transaction visible to anyone who cared to look. Ethan almost turned back twice on the ride over. The first time, he told himself he was being practical. He didn't know this woman, had no idea how she'd receive a stranger riding up to propose to her out of a clear sky, and there was something fundamentally absurd about the whole errand that made him feel like a fool. The second time, he nearly turned back because he'd crested a small rise and could see the Beaumont property laid out below him, and he had a sudden, very clear understanding that whatever happened in the next hour was going to change his life permanently, and some part of him wanted to hold on to the version of his life where that hadn't happened yet. But he rode on, because the other version of his life ended with Whitmore's padlock on the door, and that was worse. She was in the yard when he arrived, splitting wood. That was the first thing that surprised him. Not that a woman would split wood. He'd known plenty of frontier women who did harder physical work than most men, but the efficiency of it. She wasn't laboring at it. She was working through a cord of wood with the focused, rhythmic economy of someone who had done this enough times that the action lived in her hands rather than her head. She had her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back, and she was sweating in the morning cold, and she didn't stop when she heard his horse. She split the piece she was working on, set the halves aside, and only then turned to look at him. Her face was direct, not challenging, not suspicious, just present. She was looking at him the way you look at something you're trying to actually understand rather than just categorize. "Ethan Wilder," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." He dismounted because it felt wrong to have the height advantage. "You know who I am?" "I know who most people are," she said. "I pay attention." She set the axe against the splitting block and pulled her sleeves down. "You want to come in?" Her house was small but not cramped. What struck him was the books, not a few of them, arranged decoratively, the way some people kept books to look educated, but real working stacks of them, some open, some bristling with paper markers, arranged on 2 shelves and a table in a way that suggested she actually moved between them regularly. There were papers on the other table, columns of figures, and he got a brief look at them before she turned them over. He noticed she turned them over. He noticed she noticed that he noticed. She put coffee on without asking if he wanted any. He sat at the table where she pointed without being told twice. There was something in the way she moved around the small space, economic, unsentimental, comfortable, that told him this was a person who had long since decided that her own home was not going to be a place where she apologized for existing. "I'm going to say the thing straight," he said when she set the cups down and sat across from him, "because I think you'd rather hear it that way." "Usually," she said. "Caleb Whitmore came to see me last night. He's holding my debt, which I don't need to tell you is a difficult position to be in. He made me an offer." He stopped, recalibrated, and kept going. "He said he'd restructure the loan if I married you." The silence that followed was the kind that had texture to it. Clara looked at him across the table without blinking, without flinching, without doing any of the things he'd been half expecting, crying, getting angry, asking him to leave. She just sat there and looked at him, and he had the strange sensation that she was reading something written on him that he couldn't see himself. "He came to see me too," she said, finally. Ethan hadn't expected that. He set his cup down. "When?" "3 days ago." She wrapped both hands around her own cup, looking at them for a moment rather than at him. "He told me the arrangement would be mutually beneficial. He said you were a decent man who'd had hard luck, and that I'd be unlikely to find a better offer." Her voice was even, almost dry. "He said it like he was doing me a favor." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." She looked up. "I didn't say I'd do it. I didn't say I wouldn't." "What are you thinking now?" She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, "I'm thinking about why he wants this." Her eyes were steady on his. "Whitmore doesn't arrange things for other people's benefit. He arranges them for his own. Which means whatever he's getting out of this arrangement is more valuable to him than whatever it costs him to give you the restructured loan." Ethan had been thinking the same thing, but hearing her say it, quickly, precisely, without any hedging, made something shift in his chest. "He wants to humiliate us," he said. "Maybe." She turned her cup in her hands. "Or he wants us contained, busy, too occupied with surviving our own situation to pay attention to what he's doing to everyone else." She paused. "I've been paying attention to what he's doing to everyone else." "What do you mean?" She looked at him for a moment as if deciding something. Then she stood, went to the shelf where the books were, and pulled out a composition notebook from behind the front row. She set it on the table between them but kept her hand on it. "I mean that Whitmore's financial practices don't hold up under examination," she said. "I started looking at public records about 8 months ago. Recorded deeds, filed contracts, the ones in the county register, and there are patterns that don't make sense unless someone is deliberately manipulating the terms after signing." She tapped the notebook. "I've been documenting it. I haven't said anything to anyone because I don't have enough yet, and because without someone to tell it to, the documentation doesn't matter." Ethan stared at the notebook, then he stared at her. "How long have you been doing this?" 8 months, she said again, quietly. He sat back in his chair and looked at this woman across the table, this woman the town had written off, had made the subject of their casual and constant cruelty, had dismissed so thoroughly that they didn't even see her anymore, and he felt something that wasn't quite shame, because he hadn't done the cruelest things, but was adjacent to it. He'd seen her at the general store and at the edge of the Founders' Day celebration, and on the main street with her armful of ledger books, and he had filed her away in the category that Harding County had assigned to her without thinking about it too hard. She had been standing at the edge of everything, watching, taking notes, doing the work that none of them had thought to do. "Whitmore thinks this marriage makes us weaker," Ethan said slowly. "Yes," Clara said. "He thinks we're both broken enough that together we'll just collapse faster." "That's what he thinks." He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said what they were both thinking for a moment, and then Ethan said it. "What if we showed him he's wrong?" Claire's expression didn't change much, but something in it did. A fractional shift, like the door he'd seen on the main street, opening just slightly instead of closing. "I'd need to keep working," she said. "The investigation. If we're going to do this, I'm not setting it aside." "I wouldn't ask you to." "I'd need access to the ranch books, all of them, including whatever contracts you have with Whitmore. I need to see what they did to your loan specifically, because I think your situation isn't individual. I think it's one of a pattern. You can see whatever you need. And I want it understood, she said, and her voice got something harder in it, not hostile, just clear, that this isn't a rescue. I'm not coming to your ranch to keep house and be grateful. If this works, we both work. If it doesn't work, we figure out something else. I understand, Ethan said. She nodded once, slow, picked up her coffee cup, looked out the small window at the yard and the splitting block and the stacked cord of wood. Tell me about the ranch, she said. All of it. Start from the beginning. And he did. He sat in Clara Beaumont's kitchen and talked for 2 hours, and she listened with the full weight of her attention, asking questions that cut straight to the parts that mattered. And by the time he rode back toward his own land in the early afternoon with the wind picking up from the north and the sky going gray along the horizon, Ethan Wilder understood 2 things clearly. The first was that Caleb Whitmore had made a serious error in judgment. The second was that it was going to take time and work and a kind of courage that neither of them had quite named yet to prove it. But for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, the debt and the drought and the dead cattle and the failing numbers didn't feel like the whole story. They felt like the beginning of one. They were married on a Thursday, 12 days later, at the county clerk's office in Dunn's Creek, with 2 witnesses neither of them knew particularly well. A woman named Hester Prout, who worked at the dry goods store and seemed to view all weddings with the same mild, practical approval, and an old man named Douglas who was waiting for his own paperwork and agreed to sign when the clerk asked if anyone was available. There was no party, no celebration. Nobody from town came to offer congratulations, though plenty of them heard about it before sundown. What they said about it was predictable and not worth repeating in detail. The broken cowboy and the woman nobody wanted. Whitmore's little joke. How long before the whole thing fell apart? Whitmore himself sent a note the following morning, brief, almost pleasant in tone, confirming the restructured loan terms and wishing them well in their new life together. Ethan read the note at the kitchen table of his ranch house, while Clara sat across from him going through 6 years of his financial records with a pencil and a fresh composition notebook. And he thought about the look on Whitmore's face when he'd made his offer. The particular confidence of a man who had already decided how the hand was going to play. He set the note down. Across from him, Clara turned a page, made a mark in the notebook, and kept going. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through the grass, and the ranch sat on its acres of hard-won land, and the story that nobody expected was just beginning to take its shape. The first week at the ranch was not romantic, and was not easy, and was not anything like the stories people told about new beginnings. Clara arrived with 2 trunks, a crate of books, and a cast-iron skillet that she informed Ethan, without particular sentiment, had belonged to her mother and was not negotiable. He made room in the kitchen without comment. She organized the kitchen the way she organized everything, practically with no wasted motion. And within 3 days she had rearranged the storage, identified a slow leak in the roof over the back room, and begun a systematic inventory of every document, ledger, and scrap of paper related to the ranch's finances that Ethan had accumulated over 6 years. He watched her work and tried not to get in the way, which was harder than it sounded. The ranch house was not large. They were 2 people who had lived alone for years, and the adjustments were constant and small and sometimes uncomfortable, whose habits gave way to who spoke in the mornings and who needed quiet, what counted as shared space and what didn't. They navigated it without much discussion, by trial and correction, the way you figure out most things that matter. What they did not do was pretend to be something they weren't. There was no performance of happiness for each other's benefit, no forced warmth at the end of the day, no elaborate courtesy that was really just 2 strangers keeping a careful distance. What there was instead was a kind of functional honesty. They were in this together for reasons that were real, and they were going to act accordingly. If that wasn't romantic, it was at least solid, and solid was more than either of them had expected to get. By the end of the 2nd week, Ethan understood that Clara Beaumont was the most organized person he had ever encountered, and that this quality coexisted with something less comfortable, an absolute refusal to soften difficult information just because it was difficult. She came to find him in the east pasture on a Thursday afternoon, walking out with her composition notebook under her arm, and her face set in the particular expression he was already learning meant she'd found something she didn't like. He was mending a section of fence that had come down in the last wind, and he kept working while she talked because his hands needed something to do. "The original loan document," she said without preamble. "The one you signed in 1884. "What about it?" "The interest rate listed is 8% annually." She opened the notebook. "The payments you've been making. I calculated backward from the amounts and the dates. The effective rate you've actually been paying is closer to 14. Ethan's hand stopped on the fence wire. He looked at her. "That can't be right." "I checked it 4 times. She turned the notebook so he could see the columns. "The compounding structure in the contract is written in language that's technically accurate, but practically incomprehensible unless you know what you're looking for. The rate itself is stated correctly. What's not stated clearly is how and when it compounds. The wording creates a gap between what a reasonable person would understand they're agreeing to and what they're actually agreeing to." She paused. "I think that gap is deliberate." He looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time, long enough that the wind moved across the pasture grass twice and a crow called somewhere out to the west. Then he said, "How much of my debt is real?" "By my calculation?" She looked down at the notebook. "About $460 of the 840 is legitimate principal and interest. The rest is constructed from the compounding manipulation. Nearly $400 manufactured out of language and fine print, and a man who knew that an exhausted rancher signing a bridge loan wasn't going to read contract language like a lawyer." Ethan picked the wire back up and finished the splice he'd started, pulling it tight, working the pliers until his hands ached slightly from the pressure. "You said you think it's deliberate," he said. "I said I think that gap is deliberate. There's a difference between a badly written contract and a strategically written one." She closed the notebook. "I've now looked at 3 other loan documents from the county register, other families. The language is almost identical. Same compounding structure, same gap." She let that land before she added, "Same clerk's signature on all of them." Ethan set down the pliers. "Which clerk?" "The thin young man. Works the front desk at Whitmore Lending. His name is Amos Reed." She said it flat, without drama. "I don't think he designed it. I think he copies what he's told to copy, but he signed everything." "Who else is in those other contracts?" She opened the notebook again to a different page. "The Peabody family, over on the Creek Road. Walt Ogren, whose place borders yours to the north. A widow named Dora Falk, about 11 miles east, whose husband died 2 years ago and left her with the debt." She looked up. "She's behind on payments, 3 months. I checked the register last week." The widow Falk. Ethan knew her by sight, and not much more. A quiet woman, somewhere past 50, who came to town infrequently and always looked like someone carrying weight they couldn't put down. He hadn't thought about what that weight specifically was. He was beginning to understand he hadn't thought about a lot of things. "You went to the county register," he said. "How many times?" 4. "The clerk there, Norris, thinks I'm cataloging property boundaries for Margaret's estate. I let him think that." She didn't sound particularly troubled by this. "He's been very helpful." Ethan almost laughed. Almost. "Clara." "What?" "Nothing." He picked up the pliers again, then put them back down. "What do you need from me?" She thought about it for a moment. Actually thought about it, not performing consideration, but genuinely working through it. "Right now, I need you to not say anything to anyone, not Walt Ogren, not the Peabodys, nobody. If word gets back to Whitmore that someone is looking at this pattern, he'll move to cover it, and I don't have enough yet." "All right. And I need the rest of your records. Whatever you have from before 1884, your father's papers, any correspondence with Whitmore or his office before the loan, anything. There's a box in the loft. I need it tonight." He nodded. She nodded back. She turned and walked toward the house, and he watched her go. This woman who 3 weeks ago had been a stranger and a transaction and a source of abstract discomfort. And he thought about the way she'd said, "I checked it 4 times," with no particular pride in it, as though checking things 4 times was just what you did when the stakes were real. He went back to the fence, but his mind was elsewhere. The thing about living and working alongside someone you don't know is that you learn them in flashes, not in narrative. You don't learn them from what they tell you about themselves. You learn them from what they do when they're tired, when something goes wrong, when they think nobody is watching. He learned that Clara woke before dawn every morning regardless of what time she'd gone to sleep, and that she sat at the kitchen table with coffee and her notebook for an hour before she did anything else, moving through whatever she'd been turning over in her mind during the night. She didn't make conversation during that hour, and didn't expect him to. When he started leaving a second cup on the table before she got up, she didn't comment on it, but the first morning she found it there, she stopped in the doorway for just a moment before she sat down. He learned that she had a temper she kept very controlled, and that the control was visible precisely because of how practiced it was. A half-second pause before a response when something had pushed against her, a deliberate steadying of her voice, a quality of stillness that was the opposite of calm. He'd seen her use it twice in town when he'd taken her to the general store for supplies, and 2 different women had spoken to her in the particular tone that Harding County had apparently decided was her due. She'd answered each of them politely and completely, and then walked away without a word to him about it, and the cost of that control was written clearly in her face if you knew to look. He learned that she was funnier than she appeared, in a dry, sideways way that he almost missed the first few times. She didn't do it for effect. It just came out of her when she was relaxed enough, a remark so precise and unexpected that he'd find himself laughing before he'd consciously registered the joke. It seemed to surprise her slightly when it happened, as though she'd forgotten that was something she did. He learned gradually that she had been alone for a very long time. Not lonely, exactly. She didn't seem to hunger for company the way lonely people do. But there was something in her that had adapted to solitude the way a tree adapts to wind, growing strong in one direction. She was complete inside herself in a way that he respected, and that also, sometimes, at the end of a long day when they sat at the table and she was deep in her notebooks, and he was going over the work list for the next morning, made him feel the absence of something he couldn't name. She was learning him too. He could tell by the questions she asked, which got more specific as the weeks went on. She asked about the land, which acres were viable, which were played out, what his father had tried and abandoned, and why. She asked about his cattle operation with the precision of someone who had read about cattle management without having done it, and she was honest about the gap between the reading and the doing in a way that struck him as unusual. Most people didn't admit the edges of their own knowledge so plainly. "I'm right about the financial side," she told him one evening, without arrogance but also without false modesty. "I'm probably wrong about things I don't know I'm wrong about on the practical side. Tell me when I'm wrong." "You haven't been wrong yet," he said. "I will be. It's just a matter of time." She was right about that, too. 2 weeks later, she suggested a rotation schedule for the west pasture that would have made good sense if the soil drainage there had been what it looked like on the surface. But the west end had an underground clay shelf that turned it into a problem area in wet weather, which this year was shaping up to be. He told her. She looked irritated for about 30 seconds and then revised the schedule. "You should have told me about the clay shelf earlier," she said. "You didn't ask about the west pasture until now. I'm asking you to tell me things I don't know to ask about. That's a hard thing to do systematically." "Try," she said. So he tried. And she listened and wrote things down and adjusted her thinking, and between the two of them they were doing something that neither of them could have done alone, which was not a thing either of them said out loud, but which was present in the room every time they worked through a problem together, and came out the other side with something better than what either had started with. It was Walt Ogren who brought the first break. Ogren was a big, weathered Norwegian-descended man in his late 50s who farmed the land that shared a fence line with Ethan's north boundary, and who had a reputation in the county for stubbornness that his neighbors considered either a virtue or a liability, depending on whether you were on his side of a disagreement. He and Ethan had always been on reasonable terms. The particular neighborly neutrality of men who shared a fence and needed the fence to stay in good repair. They helped each other when needed and otherwise kept their separate orbits. He came by on a Saturday morning in early November, which was unusual enough that Ethan met him at the gate. Ogren sat his horse and looked at the house for a moment, then looked at Ethan. "Heard you got married," Ogren said. "A while back, yes." Ogren turned his hat in his hands, a gesture Ethan was beginning to recognize as what people did when they had something difficult to say. Heard it was the Beaumont woman. Clara, Ethan said. Her name is Clara. Ogren nodded, unsettled by something. I don't mean anything by it. I was just... He stopped, started again. I got a notice from Whitmore's office 2 weeks ago. They're saying I missed a payment in August. I didn't miss it, Wilder. I sent the money with Bill Fenner, who was going into town. I've done it that way for 3 years, and it's never been a problem. Now they're telling me there's a penalty fee, and if I don't pay it inside 60 days, they'll start proceedings. Ethan was very careful to keep his face neutral. Did Fenner confirm he delivered it? Fenner's dead. Died in September. Heart. Ogren looked down at his hat. I've got nothing in writing because I never thought I'd need anything in writing. I've done it that way for 3 years. Come inside, Ethan said. Have coffee. I don't want to impose... Walt. Ethan looked at him steadily. Come inside. Clara was at the table with her notebooks when they came in. She looked up from the page, read the situation in about 2 seconds, and closed the notebook. Mr. Ogren, she said. Sit down. What did the notice say exactly? Ogren sat. He looked at Clara with the faint discomfort of a man who wasn't sure what category to put her in, but something in her directness settled him past the awkwardness faster than Ethan expected. He described the notice in detail. The dates, the amounts, the penalty fee structure. Clara was quiet for a moment, then, Do you still have the notice? At home. I need to see it, and I need to see your original loan agreement, if you still have it. She paused. I know that's a large ask from someone you barely know. Ogren looked at her. Why do you want it? She glanced at Ethan, just briefly, checking, and he gave her a small nod. She turned back to Ogren. Because I've been looking at the Whitmore loan contracts for several months, and I believe what's happening to you is not an isolated mistake. The silence in the kitchen had weight to it. Ogren looked at Ethan, who said nothing, and then back at Clara. How many families? Ogren said. I know of 3 others with similar contract structures, Clara said carefully. There may be more I haven't found yet. Ogren sat with that for a long moment. He was a stubborn man, and stubborn men take longer to move because they think harder before they do. But when they go solidly. Tell me what you know, he said. Clara told him. Not everything. She held back the most specific details of what she'd documented, because she was still building the case, and loose information had a way of traveling in unpredictable directions. But enough. Enough for Ogren to understand what pattern she'd identified and why the penalty notice he'd received fit into it. By the time she was done, Ogren had been sitting at their kitchen table for over an hour, and the coffee had gone cold, and the expression on his face had moved through several stages and arrived somewhere between anger and a resolve that had not quite found its outlet yet. What do we do? He said. It wasn't quite a question. Right now, Clara said, you bring me that notice and your original contract. You don't respond to the notice yet, not until I've seen both. And you don't tell anyone about this conversation. Who would I tell? He said it without humor. Whitmore has connections in this county that run in directions you might not expect, Clara said. I'm not being dramatic. I'm being careful. She looked at him steadily. Can you be careful too? Ogren looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face that Ethan couldn't quite read. Not respect, or not only respect, but something more complicated than that, as if he was revising an assumption he hadn't known he was carrying. Yes, he said, I can do that. He brought the documents the next morning. Clara spread them on the table alongside Ethan's original contract and the other copies she'd pulled from the county register, and she worked through them for 4 hours while Ethan did the morning tasks around the ranch and checked on her twice without being asked to, and both times found her exactly where he'd left her, pencil in hand, moving between pages. When he came in for the midday meal, she looked up and he could tell immediately that she'd found something. Ogren's contract, she said. The penalty clause. What about it? She turned the document toward him and pointed. This language, this specific phrasing about notice of payment, it creates an obligation for the borrower to provide written confirmation of payment delivery. Not just payment, but written confirmation. She paused. Nobody told Ogren that. The clerk walked him through the payment process when he signed the contract and described it as straightforward delivery. There's no evidence Ogren was ever informed that verbal or third-party delivery needed written confirmation. She tapped the page. But the contract says it does, in language that's buried in a subclause of Section 4. Ethan sat down slowly. So the payment wasn't legally documented. Technically, but here's what's interesting. My contract has the same clause. Your contract has it, and I went back through the register pages this morning while you were outside. She picked up the notebook. The Peabody contract doesn't have it. Their version of Section 4 is written differently. She let that sit. Same lending office, same period, different contract language for different borrowers. Why different? I don't know yet. She set the notebook down. But I'm going to find out. That night, after supper, while the wind picked up outside and the temperature dropped toward the edge of early winter, Clara sat at the table and Ethan sat across from her, and neither of them spoke for a long time. The lamp burned between them and threw their shadows against the wall. "This is going to take longer than I want it to," she said finally. "How much longer? Months? Maybe into spring." She was looking at the table, not at him. "I want to be honest with you. What I have right now is suggestive. A good lawyer might be able to do something with it. But to make it undeniable, to make it something a court or a county commissioner has to act on, I need more. More contracts, more affected families, more documentation of a pattern rather than isolated irregularities." She looked up. "And I need to find out if anyone in the county office is involved, because if the recorded documents have been altered after filing, that's a different problem than what I've been working with." Ethan looked at her. The lamplight caught the side of her face and made it look for a moment like a painting. Not idealized, not softened, but truthful in the way good paintings are truthful, catching something that would otherwise be invisible. "You knew this when we got married," he said. It wasn't an accusation. "I knew it was more complicated than a few bad contracts," she said. "I didn't know how much more complicated." She held his gaze. "Does that change anything?" He thought about it because she deserved a real answer rather than an automatic one. He thought about the ranch and the debt and the 18 months and Whitmore's note, carefully pleasant, wishing them well. "No," he said. "It doesn't change anything." She nodded, looked back at her papers. He got up and put another piece of wood in the stove because the room had gotten cold without either of them noticing. "We should reach out to Dora Falk," he said from across the room. "The widow. You said she's 3 months behind." "She's going to be harder," Clara said. "She doesn't know us. And she's going to be frightened." "Probably," Ethan agreed. "But if Whitmore starts foreclosure proceedings on her while we're still building the case, we lose time and she loses everything." He came back to the table. "I'll ride out next week. She knows me slightly from before. I helped her husband with a fence repair the summer before he died. It's not much, but it's something." Clara looked at him. "You're not asking me if this is a good idea. Is it a bad idea?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she admitted. "It's the right call." Then almost to herself, "I'm not used to making decisions with someone else." "Neither am I." They looked at each other across the papers and the notebooks and the lamp, and something passed between them that neither of them had language for yet. Not affection exactly, or not only affection, but a kind of recognition. Two people registering for the first time that they were genuinely in the same fight, and neither one of them was going to flinch out of it. Outside, the Wyoming wind ran across the dark land, and somewhere north of the fence line, Walt Ogren was sitting in his own house with his own fears, and 11 miles east, a widow named Dora Falk was 3 months behind on a debt that was larger than it had any right to be. And Caleb Whitmore was in his large house in Dunn's Creek deciding, as he did every evening, what moves he would make tomorrow. He hadn't looked at the Wilder Ranch in weeks. He had no reason to. He'd made his calculations, placed his pieces, and moved on to the next problem. That was the thing about men who had never lost. They stopped watching the people they'd dismissed. And Clara Beaumont, sitting at a kitchen table in a ranch house at the edge of his county, was still watching. She was always watching. Ethan rode out to Dora Falk's place on a Tuesday into a headwind that made the 11 miles feel like 20. He'd thought carefully about what to say on the ride over and had arrived at almost nothing useful, which was probably honest. There was no good way to tell a frightened widow that the debt threatening her home was larger than it should be because the man she'd borrowed from had written her contract to make it that way. There was no approach that made that information land gently, so he decided to lead with the fence repair, with the fact that he'd known her husband, that he was a neighbor in the loose frontier sense of the word, and see what she let him through the door with. Dora Falk was a small woman with gray-streaked hair and eyes that had the particular quality of people who have been managing fear for so long, it had become a kind of background noise they no longer heard consciously. She recognized him. She let him in. She made coffee with the automatic hospitality of someone who'd been raised to do it regardless of circumstances, and she sat across from him at her kitchen table and waited to hear what he'd come to say. He told her about Clara. He told her what Clara had found, as plainly as he could, and he watched Dora's face move through several stages. Disbelief first, because it was easier to believe you'd made a mistake than to believe someone had deliberately built the mistake into your contract. Then a rigid, careful stillness that was what people looked like when something they'd been half suspecting got confirmed. Then something that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. "I knew the numbers weren't right," Dora said, finally. "My husband used to say the numbers weren't right. He'd sit here at this table and go over the payment letters and say, 'Ruth,' he called me Ruth, which was my middle name. He'd say, 'Ruth, I'm not seeing how this adds up,' but he didn't know how to challenge it. We didn't know who to talk to." She looked at her coffee cup. "He died thinking it was his own fault he couldn't get ahead of it." Ethan didn't say anything for a moment because there wasn't anything to say that would be adequate. Then he said, "Clara wants to see your original contract and any correspondence you've received from Whitmore's office. She's documenting a pattern across multiple families, and your situation fits it." "What good does documenting do if he moves on my property first?" "That's why we're moving now, before he does." He held her gaze. "We're not going to let him start proceedings without a fight, Dora. But we need your documents, and we need your patience, and we need you to trust that we're doing this as fast as we can do it right." She was quiet for a long time. The wind pushed at the windows of her house, and the fire in the stove made small sounds, and somewhere outside a shutter needed to be resecured. "All right," she said. "I'll get you what you need." She brought him a biscuit tin from the back room, the kind people used to store important papers in because it kept out mice and moisture, and inside was everything: the original contract, the payment letters, 3 years of correspondence with Whitmore's office, all of it organized in chronological order in a way that told him Dora Falk had been more methodical about this than she'd let on. She'd been preparing, in her own way, for a fight she didn't know how to start. He rode home with the tin on his saddle, leaning into the headwind, and he was thinking about what Dora had said about her husband. He died thinking it was his own fault. That was the thing Whitmore had counted on, that people would assume the problem was themselves. Clara went through Dora's documents that same evening and was still at the table when Ethan woke before dawn. She hadn't slept. He could tell by the particular quality of her stillness, and by the fact that the lamp had been refilled once and was burning low again. "Go to bed," he said. "In a minute." She didn't look up. "The Falk contract has the same Section 4 language as ours and Ogren's, but there's something else." She turned a page. Dora's husband made a lump payment in 1886. Significant, $60 at once, which would have been difficult for them to put together. According to his letter, he delivered it in person to the Whitmore office. "There's a receipt." She held up a piece of paper. "The receipt is signed, but in the current balance register, the most recent payment letter from Whitmore, that $60 doesn't appear to have been credited correctly. It's been applied, but only partially. There's a $32 gap." Ethan stared at her. They shorted the payment on record by $32, which then compounded. She set the page down. "It's small enough that you might assume it was your own arithmetic error. It's large enough, compounded over 2 years, to account for a meaningful portion of her current balance." She looked at him directly. "This is different from the contract language issue. The contract language is about how the terms were structured. This is about what happened to actual money after it was paid." The distinction hit him like cold water. "That's not manipulation. That's theft." "Yes," Clara said. "That's what it is." She went to bed shortly after. He sat at the table with Dora's receipt in his hand, a small piece of paper, a man's careful signature, $60 that had been quietly, precisely stolen in the ledger. And he felt the anger that he'd been keeping at a functional distance since this started get closer and more specific. He put the receipt back carefully. Clara was going to need it. Bus. The visit to the Peabody family came next, and it was harder than Dora Falk's in a different way. Martin Peabody was a man in his early 40s with 4 children and a wife named Annette, who had the watchful look of someone who had been listening at the edge of conversations for years, because that was the only way to know what was actually happening. Martin was initially resistant in the way that proud men are resistant when the problem you're describing touches their sense of having protected their family. He kept reframing what Clara told him as a series of misunderstandings. Maybe the contract language was just poorly written. Maybe the clerk had made honest errors. Maybe if he went back to the office and explained. Clara let him talk. She didn't argue or push. She listened to each of his reframings, and then, when he'd finished, she turned the notebook toward him and showed him the side-by-side comparison of 4 contracts. "I'm not saying you should have seen this when you signed," she said. "I'm saying it was designed to be invisible. There's a difference." She tapped the page. "This isn't poor writing. The same construction appears in 3 separate contracts across 4 years. That's not an accident." Annette Peabody, who had been sitting at the far end of the table saying nothing, spoke up. "Our deed," she said. Martin looked at her. "Show her the deed, Martin." Annette's voice was quiet, but had iron in it. "The deed has something strange in it. I've thought so for 2 years, and I've never known what to do about it." Martin went to the back of the house and returned with a document box, and the deed he pulled out did have something strange in it. A boundary description that, when compared to the original homestead filing in Clara's notes from the county register, had a discrepancy. A small one. A shift in the described eastern boundary that reduced the documented acreage by approximately 6 acres. "Was the original deed recorded by Whitmore's office?" Clara asked, very carefully. "The closing was handled through his office," Annette said. "The bank wouldn't do the financing. We went to Whitmore." Clara looked at the document for a long time without speaking. Ethan watched her face from across the table and saw the thing he'd come to recognize as the sign that her thinking had just shifted into a different gear. A quieting, a going inward, as though the visible world had become temporarily less important than what was happening in her head. "I need to compare this to the registered copy," she said, "the one that's on file at the county." She did it 3 days later on a Wednesday when Ethan drove her into Dunn's Creek on the pretext of supply shopping. She spent 45 minutes in the county register office while he loaded the wagon, and when she came out and climbed up beside him, she didn't speak until they were out of town and on the open road. "They're different," she said. He looked at her. "How different?" "The document the Peabodys have and the document in the county register do not match. The boundary language has been altered in one of them." She was holding her notebook against her knee, and her hand on it was tighter than usual, the knuckles showing the pressure. "I can't tell from looking which version was altered, but one of them was, because they cannot both be original." The wagon rolled on through the afternoon light, over the frozen ruts in the road, and neither of them spoke for a while. "If the county register copy was altered," Ethan said, "then someone with access to the register altered it." She didn't finish the thought out loud because she didn't need to. If the records themselves had been tampered with, it meant Whitmore's reach extended into the county office. It meant Clara's careful documentation, all of it built on the assumption that the county records were at least a reliable baseline, had a crack running through its foundation. "Does this break what you've built?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, thinking rather than avoiding. "No," she said, "but it changes the shape of it. The altered deed, if we can prove it's altered, is actually stronger evidence than the contract language. It's harder to explain as ambiguous. It's harder to attribute to poor drafting." She exhaled. "What I need is the original survey document, the one filed before Whitmore's office was involved. If that still exists somewhere, it gives us a baseline that predates any alteration." "Where would it be?" "The Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, potentially, or with the original surveyor if he's still practicing." She opened the notebook to a new page and wrote something. I need to find out who conducted the Peabody Homestead Survey in 1879. It took her 10 days and a series of carefully worded letters, written in a hand that gave no indication they'd been written by a woman, to establish that the original survey had been conducted by a man named Clifford Pruitt, who was still living and working out of Laramie. She wrote him. He wrote back. His records, he said, were complete and organized because he was that kind of man. He would be in the Dunn's Creek area in March for another engagement and could bring the relevant documents if she could tell him precisely what she needed. She wrote back and told him precisely what she needed. March was 4 months away. It felt like both forever and not long enough. Thus, November turned into December and the work continued in the rhythm that it had established. Clara at her documents, Ethan at the ranch, and in the difficult geography of quiet conversations with neighbors who were scared, the two of them meeting at the kitchen table in the evenings to put what they'd each found alongside what the other knew and see what new shape it made. It was not a smooth process. There were arguments, real ones, not performances of disagreement, but actual moments where they were pulling in different directions, and neither of them was wrong exactly, but they weren't going the same way either. Clara wanted to move more slowly than Ethan's instincts liked. He wanted to bring in Walt Ogren more fully, to start building what felt like an alliance of affected families. She kept pulling back on that, pointing out that every additional person who knew what they were building was another potential leak back to Whitmore. At some point, Ethan said on a cold December evening when they'd been going around on this for an hour, we have to trust someone. I know that, she said, with the particular edge that appeared in her voice when she was tired and being pushed. I'm trying to make sure the someone we trust doesn't get the information back to Whitmore before we're ready to move. Ogren's not going to. I don't think Ogren would do it intentionally. I think he'd tell his wife because she's a reasonable person to tell, and his wife would mention it to her sister who comes to visit twice a month, and her sister knows the Hanley family, and Daniel Hanley runs freight for Whitmore twice a year. She looked at him. Chains of trust aren't about whether people are honest. They're about how information moves. He didn't have a response to that because she wasn't wrong. He was quiet for a moment. Then, how long before we're ready to move? If Pruitt's documents are what I think they are, and if the county commissioner circuit comes through Dunn's Creek on its spring schedule, March or April. She looked at the table. And there's one more piece I need. What piece? Amos Reed. He looked up. The clerk. He signed everything. He knows what he was doing, or he knew enough to do it without asking questions. Either way, he's the person who can explain the gap between the contract language and what borrowers were told. She had been thinking about this for a while. He could tell. There was a settled quality to the way she said it, like a decision already arrived at rather than one still in progress. I need to talk to him. He works for Whitmore. He does. She folded her hands on the table. But he's not a powerful man. He's a man who was handed a tool and told to use it, and probably didn't ask enough questions about why. Those men sometimes. She paused. Sometimes, if you approach them correctly, they're relieved to talk to someone. And if he goes straight to Whitmore, then we move faster than we planned. She met his eyes. It's a risk. I know it's a risk. He sat with it. Outside, the December wind was working against the walls of the house with the persistence it had in that part of Wyoming, testing every joint and seam. The stove ticked and shifted. You've already thought about how you'd approach him, he said. Yes. Tell me. She told him. He listened and asked 2 questions, and when she'd answered them, he said, That's good. That might work. He meant it. She'd thought through the angles the way she thought through everything. Not perfectly, because there was no perfect here, but thoroughly and honestly, accounting for what could go wrong. I'll go to the Whitmore office on a Friday, she said. Payment day. It's busy. He'll be distracted, and there won't be time for him to think about whether to go to Whitmore before I've said what I need to say. She picked up her pencil. I'll tell him I need clarification on our payment schedule. That's believable. New wife, getting familiar with the paperwork. I'll bring the contract and I'll ask him, in the middle of everything else, to explain Section 4 to me. What do you expect him to do? I don't know, she said. That's the part I can't calculate in advance. She looked at him. I'm better at documents than people. You're better at people than you think, he said. She looked at him for a moment, and that door opened slightly. The same one he'd seen on the main street when they were still strangers, the one she kept careful control of. Then she looked back at the table. Don't tell me comfortable things, she said. I need to be accurate. I'm not being comfortable, he said. I'm being accurate. She didn't respond to that, but she didn't close the door all the way either. She went to the Whitmore office on the second Friday of December. Ethan drove her into town and waited at the feed store, which was close enough that he could see the front of the Whitmore lending office across the street without being visible himself. He didn't know what he would do if something went wrong in there, which was a thought he set aside because it wasn't useful. She was inside for 22 minutes. He counted. When she came out, she walked to the wagon at a normal pace, climbed up, arranged her skirts, and waited until they were out of the main street before she spoke. He explained Section 4, she said. Did he? At length, more length than necessary for someone clarifying a routine question. She was looking at the road ahead. He's uncomfortable. He knows exactly what that language does, and he's been waiting for someone to ask about it for a while. You could hear it in the way he talked, not guilty exactly, but braced, like a man who's been holding a position he doesn't believe in for long enough that he's tired. Did he say anything that helps? He said something very interesting. She opened her notebook, which she'd somehow managed to write in while inside the office, and read, He said, and I wrote this as close to verbatim as I could, the schedule is outlined in the agreement, Mrs. Wilder, and it follows the standard structure we use for all of our clients. He said, standard structure. She looked up. He didn't say, as outlined in your agreement. He said, the standard structure we use. He's confirming it's uniform. He's confirming it's not accidental variation. Ethan thought about that. Will he talk to someone with authority? A lawyer? A commissioner? I don't know yet. She closed the notebook. But I left him with something to think about. She paused. I told him I'd been comparing notes with some of the other families who bank with Whitmore. I didn't say who. I just told him that several of us had found the same question about Section 4, and that we were planning to bring it to the circuit commissioner in the spring. You told him we're going to the commissioner. Yes. That might get back to Whitmore. It might, she said. But Reed is a man who needs to know there's a door he can walk through. I gave him the shape of the door. What he does with it is up to him. She looked out at the road, the frozen prairie running out on both sides, the sky going gray at the horizon. Sometimes you have to plant something and wait. He nodded. He was beginning to understand her rhythms. The calculated patience, the willingness to let things develop at their own pace rather than forcing them before they were ready. It was not a natural disposition for him. He was a man who fixed things when they were broken, who responded to problems with action. But he was learning, in the particular way that you learn things from people who approach the world differently than you do, that there were problems where action was less effective than time, and evidence, and the precise application of truth at the right moment. He was also learning that he trusted her judgment in a way he hadn't trusted many people's judgment in his life. Not blindly. He'd argued with her enough times to know this wasn't deference, but genuinely. She'd earned it, one correct assessment at a time, and he was honest enough with himself to recognize what that meant. January brought the hardest weather of the winter, and a new problem that Ethan hadn't anticipated. The gossip had shifted. He first noticed it at the feed store, a Saturday in mid-January when he'd gone in for oats and found himself in a conversation with two men he knew moderately well. Harv Simmons, who ran a small stock operation south of town, and a man named Culp, who Ethan knew mostly by sight. They were friendly enough, but there was something in the conversation, a specific quality of casualness that wasn't quite natural, that made him pay attention. Simmons mentioned Clara. He mentioned it lightly, sideways, in the way people bring up something they're genuinely curious about but have been told makes them look bad. He said he'd heard she'd been asking around about the Whitmore contracts. He said it the way you'd mention a rumor, with just enough distance from it to claim you were only passing along what you'd heard. Ethan kept his face neutral. Where'd you hear that? Around, Simmons shrugged. People talk. People do, Ethan agreed, and bought his oats and left. He told Clara that evening, and she listened without visible surprise, which meant she'd been expecting something like this or something like it. Reed didn't go to Whitmore, she said, or not Reed directly, but someone else noticed I was in the office that Friday. Or Reed mentioned it to someone casually without thinking through who they might mention it to. She was looking at her notebook, but he could tell she wasn't really seeing the page. It doesn't change what we're doing, but it changes our timeline. How? If Whitmore knows we're looking, he'll move faster. She set the notebook down. And he has a move I've been thinking about. The foreclosure proceedings on Dora Falk. He hasn't started them yet, even though she's behind. I've wondered why. She looked up. I think he was waiting to see how this played out. If he thinks we're building a case against him, he might start those proceedings now, as a warning, as a way of demonstrating that his timeline moves faster than ours. And if he starts proceedings? Dora loses her property inside 60 days unless she can make up the payments, which she can't. Her voice was flat with the effort of staying clinical. And it will frighten every other family who's in a similar position. It'll be a message. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, can we make up her payments for her? Clara looked at him. We barely have enough for ours. I know, but if Ogren contributed, and the Peabodys, you're talking about asking people who are themselves struggling to pay someone else's debt to a man who's been stealing from all of them. She said it bluntly, not cruelly, just honestly. It's a hard ask. I know it's a hard ask. They'd do it, probably. She was thinking out loud now. Walt Ogren would. Annette Peabody would talk Martin into it. She looked at the table. But it buys Dora 3 months at most. Whitmore will just move again. 3 months might be enough. If Pruitt arrives with his documents and we go to the commissioner, if, she said, there are a lot of ifs between now and March. There are always ifs, he said. You can't wait for all of them to resolve. She looked at him for a moment. Something in his delivery must have surprised her, because she went quiet in the considering way rather than the resistant way. Then she nodded, once, slow. Talk to Ogren, she said. Let me calculate exactly what's needed to get Dora current. We'll know in a few days if Whitmore moves on her, and if he does, we'll need to be ready to move on the pooling quickly. She picked up her pencil. And we need to call in everyone who's affected. Together, not separately. They need to meet each other. That was the turn Ethan had been waiting for. The shift from individual conversations to something collective. When? Not yet. Not until we're closer to ready. She wrote something in the margin of the notebook. But soon. These families need to know they're not alone. That's its own kind of evidence. Not legal evidence, but the kind that holds people together when Whitmore pushes back. He nodded. He got up to bank the stove for the night, moving through the familiar small tasks of the house that had become, over these 3 months, genuinely familiar rather than just his. He hung up the poker, checked the damper, turned back toward the room. Clara had fallen asleep at the table. Her head was down on her arm, her pencil still in her loose fingers, the notebook open under her cheek. It was the first time he'd seen her actually give out before she decided to stop, the first time the work had overtaken the will. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at her. Then he got the blanket from the chair by the window, where it lived because the chair by the window was cold, and they'd both learned this independently, and he draped it over her shoulders without waking her. She stirred slightly, shifted, resettled. He turned the lamp down low and went to bed. The letter arrived on a Thursday in late January, addressed to Ethan, in handwriting he didn't recognize. He opened it at the kitchen table while Clara watched. Inside was a single sheet, no salutation, no signature, just 4 lines of careful handwriting. The payment on your account from September 1885 was recorded incorrectly in our ledger. I have the original receipt. If you want to discuss the discrepancy, I will be at the Dunn's Creek Library reading room on Saturday, the February 3rd at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Come alone. I mean this in good faith. Clara read it twice. She was very still. Ethan said. Yes. She set the letter down. He wants to meet. He wants to talk. She looked at the letter again. Come alone. She looked up at Ethan. He's scared of me, probably. Or scared of being seen with a woman who's been asking questions. Or both. I'll go. I know. She picked up the letter, folded it carefully. Listen to everything. Don't push him toward anything he's not already moving toward. If he wants to tell you something, let him tell it in his own time. She paused. And find out what he wants. You think he wants something? Everyone who does something like this wants something, she said. Not necessarily something bad. Maybe just reassurance. Maybe just to know that if this falls on Whitmore, it won't fall on him too. But find out. He went on Saturday. The Duns Creek Library was a small room adjacent to the Masonic Hall, maintained by a committee of women who rotated its one-day-a-week hours. It was empty in the February cold, except for Amos Reed, who was sitting at the single reading table with a cup of something hot and the look of a man who had made a decision and was now living with the terror of having made it. He was younger than Ethan had registered from a distance. Mid-20s, probably. He had the hands of someone who worked primarily with paper, pale, ink-stained at the fingertips, faintly trembling when they wrapped around the cup. Ethan sat across from him and didn't speak first. Reed looked at the table for a long moment. Then he said, "How many families?" "That my wife has documented," Ethan said. "4. There may be others." Reed nodded like he'd been expecting a larger number. "There are others," he said quietly. "I know of at least 3 more that match the same structure. One of them—" He stopped. "One of them, the family lost the property last winter. They moved on. I don't know where." Ethan kept his hands flat on the table. "What do you want to tell me, Mr. Reed?" Reed looked at him directly for the first time. "I want to tell you that I didn't design it. I want to tell you that when I started working there, it was presented to me as standard practice, and I didn't know enough then to know it wasn't." His jaw moved. "I know enough now." "How long have you known enough?" A long pause. 2 years. 2 years, Ethan said. "I needed the work." He said it without defiance, just flatly, as a statement of the conditions of his life. "I have a mother who's sick. I have rent. I told myself the structure was legal, and it is legal, technically, and I told myself that people should read what they sign, and they should, and—" He stopped. "None of that is sufficient. I know that." "What do you have?" Ethan said. "What can you give us?" Reed reached into his coat and placed a folded paper on the table between them. "The original payment record from your September 1885 installment, the entry as it appears in the current ledger, and a comparison." He placed a second page. "There's a discrepancy. Someone adjusted the credit after the fact. It wasn't me. I was in the office the day your father made that payment. It was before you took over the ranch, and I watched the clerk before me record it correctly. The adjusted version appeared in the ledger sometime in the following 6 months after he left." He looked at the papers. "I kept these because I thought one day they might matter." Ethan looked at the papers. A discrepancy in the Wilder account. Money adjusted quietly after the payment was made. His father's money, his father's careful, struggling payments on a debt that someone had made bigger when he wasn't looking. He thought about his father dying with his hands shaking, handing over the ranch with 2 words that sounded like an apology. "Will you testify to this?" he said. "Before a commissioner, in writing, sworn." Reed was quiet for long enough that Ethan thought the answer was going to be no. Then, "If I'm protected. If there's a process where what I've told you can come through legal channels rather than just me going in and accusing a powerful man of fraud with nothing but my word." "My wife is building that process," Ethan said. "What you've brought today is part of it, but it has to be more than these 2 pages." "I know." Reed looked at the papers one more time and then pushed them across the table. "There's more I can document. I've kept notes. Things I observed. Dates, instructions I was given, entries I watched being changed. I kept them because—" He exhaled. "I suppose I knew that one day I'd either use them or I'd spend the rest of my life wishing I had." Ethan picked up the papers. He thought about what Clara had said. Find out what he wants. "What do you need from us?" he said. "I need to know," Reed said, "that if this goes where you say it's going, if Whitmore goes before a court, I need to know that what I've told you will be presented as documentary evidence rather than as my personal accusation. I'm not—" He pressed his lips together. "I'm not a brave man. I'm trying to do the right thing. Those are not always the same." "They're the same today," Ethan said. Reed looked at him. Something in his face shifted. Not relief, not quite, but a loosening, a marginal release of a held thing. He nodded. They shook hands across the library table in the thin February light, and Ethan rode home through the cold with the papers inside his coat where they'd stay dry, and he was thinking about his father, and about Dora Falk's husband, and about the Peabody family's 6 missing acres, and about Whitmore sitting in his large house deciding every evening what moves to make tomorrow. He was also thinking about what he was going to say to Clara when he walked through the door, and how she was going to look when she understood that the case she'd been building for months had just acquired the one piece it had been missing. He walked into the kitchen and she looked up from the table, reading his face before he said a single word. And what crossed her expression in that moment was not triumph. She wasn't that kind of person, but something quieter and more complicated, the look of someone who had carried a very heavy thing for a long time and could feel, for the first time, the ground beginning to firm up beneath them. He sat down. He put the papers on the table between them. "Tell me everything," she said. And in the cold kitchen of the Wilder ranch, with the February wind working against the walls and the lamp burning steady, he did. Clara spent 3 days with Reed's documents before she said anything conclusive about them. She was not a person who rushed toward conclusions, which Ethan had learned was both a strength and, in the particular mathematics of living alongside someone, occasionally difficult to watch. He would come in from the morning work and find her in the same position he'd left her, the documents spread in their organized arrangement, her pencil moving in small, deliberate marks. She ate when he put food in front of her. She slept when her body stopped cooperating. Everything else was secondary to the work of understanding exactly what they had and exactly what it meant. On the 4th morning, she was waiting for him when he came in from the barn. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She had organized the documents into 3 groups, each weighted with a small stone she'd apparently brought in from the yard for exactly this purpose. She had the instinct of someone who needed the physical world to mirror the structure in her head. "The first group," she said, touching the left pile, "is what we had before Saturday. Contract language, payment discrepancies across 4 families, Ogren's penalty notice, the Peabody deed comparison. Individually suggestive, collectively a pattern. A good lawyer could argue with it. A bad judge could dismiss it. And the second group," she touched the middle pile which held Reed's documents. "This changes the weight of everything else. The original entry and the adjusted entry in your family's payment record are in different handwriting, not different enough that you'd notice casually. Someone was careful about that. But under close examination, the letter formations in the adjusted figures are distinct from the surrounding entries." She paused. "I'm not a handwriting expert. A court would need one. But Reed's notes name the specific date the previous clerk left the office and the approximate window in which he believes the adjustment was made. If we can establish that the original clerk was no longer present when the alteration happened, the list of people who could have made it gets very short." "How short?" "2 people. Riddy, who says he didn't do it and has documented reasons to be believed, and the man who supervised the office during that period." She looked at him. "Who was not Whitmore directly?" "It was a man named Garfield Pruis who managed the lending office's day-to-day operations and who left Whitmore's employ in 1886. "Where's Pruis now?" "Reed doesn't know, but he's in the record. The county payroll register for 1884 through 1886. He existed. He was there. And if we can find him—" She didn't finish that sentence because she didn't need to. If they could find Pruis, and if Pruis had his own reasons to talk, the handwriting question became considerably less hypothetical. Ethan looked at the 3rd pile. "What's the 3rd group?" Clara's hand rested on the right pile without touching it. This was unusual for her. She was normally precise and efficient with physical things. No hesitation. The pause meant something. "Reed gave me something else when I went back to see him on Monday," she said. He looked up. She hadn't told him she'd gone back. "I went alone because I didn't want him to feel outnumbered," she said, before he could say anything about it. "He's still frightened, and he needed to feel like he was talking to one person, not 2. She held his gaze for a moment, and he accepted this and nodded, and she continued. "He gave me an internal document from the Whitmore office, a memorandum from 1883, before our loan, before the Peabody loan, before most of what we've documented. It's addressed to Whitmore himself, from Pruis, outlining the payment recording structure and how the Section 4 language functions in practice. Meaning someone wrote it down. Meaning someone wrote it down, she confirmed. In plain language, without the deliberate obscurity of the contracts. The memo describes the gap between what borrowers understand they're agreeing to and the actual mechanical function of the compounding structure, and it describes this gap as a feature. She picked up the top page from the third pile and read from it, her voice careful and level. The language as drafted ensures that standard borrower interpretation will underestimate actual obligation, creating consistent opportunities for penalty application and balance augmentation that remain within defensible contractual bounds. The kitchen was very quiet. Balance augmentation, Ethan said. That's what he called it. She set the page down. Stealing. He called stealing balance augmentation and filed it in a memo to his employer, who kept it. She looked at the document. Whitmore kept it, which means either he didn't think anyone would ever find it, or he wanted a record that the scheme had been proposed and approved at a level above him. She frowned. I can't decide which is more likely. Probably the first. Ethan thought about the memo sitting in a Whitmore office file for 5 years, patient and incriminating, waiting for someone to know where to look. How did Reed have access to it? He was given access to the historical files when Pruce left. Whitmore trusted him because he'd been compliant for 2 years and showed no signs of being anything else. Her voice had something dry and complicated in it. Whitmore is not wrong that most people stay compliant. He just miscalculated on Reed eventually, and on me. She straightened the papers. And on you. He looked at her. She was looking at the documents and not at him, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that told him she'd meant the last 2 words differently than the rest of the sentence. This is enough, he said. What you have. It's enough. Almost, she said. We still need Clifford Pruitt's survey documents for the Peabody deed comparison. That arrives with March. She closed the notebook. And we need the meeting with the families before we go to the commissioner. They need to be prepared for what happens when this becomes public, because Whitmore will not go quietly, and some of them are going to face pressure before it's over. When do we call the meeting? She looked at the calendar on the wall, a practical object marked with dates and weather observations and notes in her handwriting that had accumulated over the months until the margins were full. February is almost gone. Pruitt arrives in early March, the circuit commissioners in Dunn's Creek the 3rd week of March. She calculated. We call the meeting the first Saturday of March. That gives us time to prepare people, and time to act on whatever Pruitt brings us, and still file before the commissioner moves on. That's 4 weeks. Yes. A lot can happen in 4 weeks. I know, she said. What happened was that Whitmore moved first. Done. The notice arrived at Dora Falk's property on a Wednesday, delivered by Whitmore's man, a large, quiet person named Tesler, who handled Whitmore's less pleasant errands and whose manner conveyed, without words, that there was no point in arguing with the piece of paper he was handing you. The notice informed Dora that her account was 90 days in arrears, and that foreclosure proceedings would commence in 45 days absent full payment of the outstanding balance, which the notice listed as $218. Dora sent her neighbor's boy to the Wilder Ranch with word the same afternoon. Clara read the notice that evening and was very still for a long moment before she said, He knows. Or he's on his normal schedule, and this is coincidence, Ethan said, without much conviction. It's not coincidence. She set the notice on the table. The amount listed, $218. That's not her actual arrears if you calculate correctly against her payment history. It's inflated by $31. Penalty fees applied using the Section 4 structure. She looked at him. He's showing us what he can do. He's telling us to look at this number and understand that he can move on anyone in this county the same way, anytime he wants, and we cannot stop him fast enough. Ethan thought about Dora at her kitchen table with her biscuit tin of carefully organized papers, her dead husband's assumption that the debt was his own failure. Then we move on the pooling now, he said. We don't wait for March. We still can't pay the inflated amount. We shouldn't. It would legitimize the penalty structure. She was already thinking through it. He could tell. We pay her legitimate arrears, the amount she actually owes on the correct calculation. And we file a formal written objection to the penalty fees with the county register, citing specific contract language before the 45 days are up. It doesn't stop the proceedings by itself, but it creates a documented dispute that a commissioner has to address before a foreclosure can complete. Can we file that objection ourselves, without a lawyer? Any party to a contract dispute can file a written objection with the county register, she said. It doesn't have the weight of a legal filing, but it goes in the record. And the record is what we're building. She stood up. Ride to Ogren tonight. Tell him what's happened and what we need. I'll write the objection letter. He rode to Ogren's place in the dark, through cold that had teeth in it, and came back 2 hours later with Walt Ogren's agreement and $40 he'd had in a locked box in his barn, and a handshake that had the weight of something formal. The Peabodys contributed $25 the next morning. Ethan put in what he could. Between them, they covered Dora's actual arrears with $11 remaining, and Clara filed the objection letter with the county register that Friday, signed with her own name, citing the specific clauses and the specific calculation method by which the penalty fees had been derived. The clerk at the register was a different person than usual. The regular one was apparently ill, and the substitute took the letter and stamped it with the date and filed it without reading it carefully, which meant Whitmore didn't hear about it until Monday. Ethan heard, secondhand from Harv Simmons, who had heard from someone at the Whitmore office, that Whitmore's reaction to the filed objection letter had been silence, a specific considered silence, the kind that meant he was recalculating. That silence was its own kind of information. Clifford Pruitt arrived on the 6th of March, on a Thursday, driving his own wagon with his own documents organized in a flat case that he handled with the particular care of a man whose livelihood depended on the precision of his records. He was in his 60s, lean and weather-beaten in the way of men who spent most of their professional lives outdoors, with a deliberate quality to his speech that Ethan took to mean he was someone who said things once and expected them to be heard. Clara had the Peabody deed and the county register copy waiting on the table when he arrived. She showed him both without preamble. He put on his spectacles, examined each one, and asked for his survey documents, which he opened to the relevant pages with the efficiency of someone who knew his own files intimately. He compared the 3 documents for approximately 10 minutes in silence. The original survey boundary, he said finally, runs 37 feet east of where this registered deed places it. He tapped the county register copy. This document is not consistent with the survey I conducted and filed. The boundary described here would exclude the eastern strip entirely. He looked up. I filed my survey with the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne and with the Harding County Register simultaneously in the spring of 1879. They should be identical. They are not, Clara said. I can see that. He took his spectacles off and looked at her directly. Someone altered the registered copy. Yes. After it was filed. That's what we believe. He was quiet for a moment. That is a serious allegation. Yes, Clara said. It is. Will you provide a sworn affidavit comparing your original survey to the registered copy? He thought about it with the unhurried deliberation of a man who respected the weight of formal commitment. Then, I will, on the condition that you show me whatever else you have, because I want to understand what I'm putting my name into. So she showed him. She showed Clifford Pruitt everything. The contract comparisons, the payment discrepancy documentation, the Reed papers, the memo with its carefully bureaucratic description of systematic theft. He read each piece with the same unhurried attention he'd given the survey comparison, and when he was finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. How long has this been going on? He said. Based on the earliest documentation we found, at least since 1882, Clara said, possibly earlier. And the families affected. We have documented evidence of 7. There are likely others. Pruitt looked at his hands. The Peabody's 6 acres, those acres are productive? Yes, Ethan said. Good pasture land along a creek line. So Whitmore's records show acreage he doesn't legally own. Pruitt looked at Clara. If a future sale were made based on those records, the fraud compounds, Clara said. Correct. He nodded slowly, processing the full architecture of what she'd built. You're going to the circuit commissioner. 3rd week of March, Clara said. We have an appointment. I'll have the affidavit ready before then. He closed his document case. I've been surveying land in this territory for 30 years. My reputation is built on the integrity of my records." He said it without drama, as a statement of what was at stake for him personally. If someone has used my survey to create a fraudulent registered document, that is a direct attack on the thing I've spent my life building. He looked at Clara. "I will not sit down on this." After Pruitt left, Clara sat at the table for a long time without moving. Ethan made coffee and put a cup beside her and sat across from her, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window at a low angle that was beginning to carry the first suggestion of spring warmth, still thin, still unreliable, but present. "You did it," he said. "We haven't done it yet." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "The commissioner still has to receive it. A process still has to run. Whitmore still has lawyers and money and relationships in this county that we don't." She looked at the stacked documents. "And he's going to find out about Pruitt. Someone will tell him a surveyor came to see us. He'll know what that means." "Then we call the meeting this Saturday," Ethan said. "We can't wait any longer." She nodded. "Yes, Saturday." Thumb. They came on a Saturday morning in cold, clear March sunlight to the Wilder Ranch, 7 families in total, arriving by wagon and on horseback across the hard-packed dirt of the yard, tying horses at the fence line, filing into the house in the particular tentative way of people who weren't sure what they were walking into. Walt Ogren and his wife, Martin and Annette Peabody, with 2 of their older children who Martin had insisted on bringing, and Annette had allowed because she understood that the children needed to know what their parents were capable of. Dora Falk, who had driven herself 11 miles in the early morning cold and arrived first. The Sutter family from the South Creek Road, whom Clara had contacted through Ogren in the past 2 weeks. A man named Hector Vance, who farmed alone and said almost nothing but whose face was a document of its own kind of damage. And a young couple, the Delaney's, who had been married 3 years and whose contract with Whitmore was the most recent of any in the room, and whose remaining debt was the largest. The house was not built to hold this many people. They arranged themselves on chairs and along the walls and in the kitchen doorway, and the room had the particular charge of a space where people who have been separately afraid are encountering the fact that they were never alone in it. Clara stood at the head of the table with her documents in front of her and looked at all of them for a moment before she spoke. "I'm going to tell you what we know," she said. "All of it. And then I'm going to tell you what we're going to do. I'd ask you to hold your questions until I'm finished, because what I have to say is connected all the way through, and it'll make more sense if you hear it that way." She talked for an hour and 10 minutes. She was not a natural speaker in the performance sense. She didn't have the preacher's rhythm or the politician's warmth, and she made no attempt at either. What she had was precision and the particular authority of someone who had done the work and knew it down to the bone, and that turned out to be more compelling than eloquence. She walked them through the contract structure, through the payment discrepancies, through the deed alteration, through Reed's documents and Pruitt's survey comparison, through the memorandum with its bureaucratic language for theft. She showed them, on a large sheet of paper she'd prepared the previous evening, the side-by-side comparison of their contracts. She showed them, on a second sheet, the calculated difference between what each family actually owed and what Whitmore's records claimed they owed. The room was completely silent while she talked. Not the silence of people who weren't listening, but the silence of people who were listening with everything they had. When she finished, the first person to speak was Annette Peabody. "The 6 acres, she said. Her voice was controlled, but barely. "He took our 6 acres on paper and we didn't know." "Yes," Clara said. "If we'd sold the property, the sale would have been based on the fraudulent registered acreage. You would have received payment for the reduced acreage and had no legal record to contest it." Clara held her gaze. "That's why the deed alteration matters beyond your specific situation. It creates a mechanism for future fraud that doesn't require any additional action from Whitmore's office." Martin Peabody, who had been resistant in their first conversation and then had come around and whom Ethan had since learned was a man whose resistance was usually the first stage of a more thorough commitment than most people managed, spoke up from his chair against the wall. "What happens to him?" "If the commissioner accepts our documentation," Clara said, "the case goes to a territorial court. The contracts are examined. The payment records are examined. The deed discrepancy becomes part of a formal fraud investigation." She was precise and careful. I'm not going to tell you this is certain or fast. Courts take time. Whitmore will have legal representation. This is not going to be quick. But his properties, Hector Vance said. It was the first thing he'd said since arriving. His lending operation. The land he holds that's connected to these loans. A court can freeze assets during investigation, Claire said. And if the foreclosure proceedings against any of our properties advance while the fraud case is active, a commissioner can issue a stay. She looked at Dora Falk. That includes you, Dora. The objection we filed creates the record we need to argue for a stay if he tries to move forward. Dora nodded. Her face was composed in the way that faces are composed when the emotion is too large for expression. She just nodded and kept nodding slightly even after she'd stopped, like a clock winding down. The questions came then, and they were good questions. Specific, practical, the questions of people who had been living with this problem long enough to know where the edges were. Walt Ogren wanted to know what Whitmore could do to them legally in retaliation before the process ran its course. Clara answered honestly. He could accelerate collection proceedings. He could make it difficult with the local bank. He could apply social pressure through his network of relationships in the county. He could make the next several months genuinely hard. He'll probably try at least some of that, she said. I want you to be prepared for it. What does being prepared look like? The young Delaney husband asked. It looks like this, Clara said. Us. In the same room, knowing what we know. The room was quiet again for a moment, and then Walt Ogren said something that Ethan thought about for a long time afterward. He said, I've been farming this land for 19 years. I've dealt with drought and disease and 2 brothers who borrowed against the property without telling me, and 1 winter that killed half my herd. None of that broke me. He looked around the room. This man was trying to break something that the land couldn't. He looked at Clara. We're going to the commissioner. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded. Together, Annette Peabody said. There was a murmur through the room that was not quite words and did not need to be. Whitmore's response came faster than Clara had predicted, which told them that his network in the county was better than she'd calculated. Within a week of the meeting, 3 of the families present had received letters from Whitmore's office. Not foreclosure notices, but queries, demands for clarification on payments, requests for documentation of transactions going back years. The letters were legal and not threatening in any explicit way, and were intended to do exactly what threatening letters would have done while remaining deniable. Martin Peabody brought his letter to Clara on a Tuesday, and she read it with the careful expression of someone identifying a move in a game she'd been playing for months. He's fishing, she said. He wants to know if we'll scatter, if we'll start making individual side arrangements to avoid trouble. She set the letter down. Don't respond, any of you. All correspondence goes through me, and the response to all of it is the same. We refer him to the county commissioner's office, where our documentation has been filed. Has it been filed? Peabody asked. It will be by Friday, she said. She and Ethan drove into Dunn's Creek on Thursday morning with the full documentation in a case Clara had constructed from a wooden box and 2 metal hasps she'd found in the barn, because the papers deserved something stronger than a cloth bag. The circuit commissioner had a temporary office set up in the Masonic Hall adjacent to the library, the same building where Ethan had met Reed 2 months ago, which struck him as the kind of coincidence that didn't mean anything but that he noticed anyway. The commissioner was a compact, silver-haired man named Aldous Beck, who had the air of someone who had spent 30 years seeing exactly the kind of thing Clara was about to show him and had developed a corresponding economy of reaction. He received them without particular ceremony, gestured at chairs, and waited for them to begin. Clara opened the case and began. Beck asked few questions while she presented. He read what she put in front of him with the unhurried attention of someone who read documents for a living and understood what he was looking at. When she reached the Pruitt affidavit and the side-by-side deed comparison, he held the 2 documents next to each other for a long time without speaking. This survey discrepancy, he said finally. Pruitt is prepared to testify to this. He is, Clara said. His affidavit is attached, and he has indicated willingness to appear in person. Beck set the documents down. He looked at the memo, the balance augmentation memo, as Ethan had started thinking of it, and read it twice. His expression through all of this had been neutral in the professional way, not cold, just contained. "Mrs. Wilder," he said, "how long have you been compiling this?" "Since August," Clara said, "of last year." He looked at her for a moment. "You did this yourself?" "With my husband's assistance, and with the cooperation of the affected families." She held his gaze. "And with Amos Reed, who I would ask be considered a cooperative witness rather than a party to the fraud. He provided documentation voluntarily and at personal risk." Beck made a note. He looked at the full spread of documents on the table between them. Months of work, 7 families' worth of evidence, the careful architecture of a case built by a woman in a ranch house kitchen, while the rest of the county had decided she wasn't worth paying attention to. "I'm going to need to retain copies of all of this," he said. "I brought copies," Clara said. She produced a second set from the case. Beck almost smiled. "Of course you did." He gathered the copies and squared them on the table. "I want to be honest with you about the timeline. This goes to the territorial court in Cheyenne, and that process takes months, not weeks. The fraud investigation will involve the territorial attorney's office. Whitmore will be notified and will respond through counsel." He looked at both of them. "In the meantime, I can issue an administrative notice to Whitmore Lending requiring them to suspend collection actions on the accounts of the named families pending the court's review. That notice has teeth. Ignoring it is contempt of an administrative order." "That protects the families during the process," Ethan said. "It does," Beck said. "It's not a verdict, but it puts a wall between them and Whitmore while the wall that matters is being built." He looked at Clara. "Are there other families you haven't named in this documentation who may be affected?" "Possibly," she said. "I know of at least 2 situations I haven't been able to confirm. I'd recommend the administrative notice be framed broadly enough to invite other parties to come forward." Beck made another note. "That's a good instinct." He issued the administrative notice that afternoon. By the time the sun went down on Dunn's Creek that Thursday, a formal document bearing the commissioner's seal was on its way to Whitmore Lending, and the case that Clara Beaumont had built in the margins of a frontier winter was no longer just a stack of papers in a wooden box. It was a legal proceeding. Whitmore came to the Frontier Fair. He came because he always came, because the Frontier Fair was the largest annual gathering in Harding County, and Whitmore had spent 20 years making himself a fixed and imposing presence at it, the kind of man whose attendance was a statement. He arrived in his good coat with 2 men from his office, and he moved through the crowds of the fairground with the ease of someone who owned the terrain. The fair was held on the last Saturday of March, 2 weeks after the commissioner's notice had been delivered, and the county was still absorbing what that notice meant. Some people had heard only pieces. Some had heard wrong pieces. The fairground had a current running through it that was different from the usual fair energy. Not festive, exactly, but charged. Ethan was at the livestock area with Walt Ogren when Whitmore arrived, and he saw him from a distance and felt the old familiar tightening that Whitmore's presence produced. The debt, the calculation, the particular predatory patience of a man who was very good at waiting for other people to run out of options. He'd felt that tightening many times. He felt it now and then set it aside because there was work to do. Clara was on the far side of the fairground, near the community tables where the county records display had been set up. A civic presentation, organized by the county register office, showing historical documents and survey maps of the county's development. It had been on the fair calendar for months. Clara had volunteered to help organize it in January, when it was still just a calendar entry and not a strategic position. Ethan had understood what she was doing when she volunteered. He wasn't sure the register's office clerk had. The display included, among other historical documents, the original survey maps of Harding County parcels, including the Peabody parcel, Clifford Pruitt's 1879 survey, displayed alongside the county's own registered record for context and historical comparison. This had been presented to the clerk as an educational display of how survey documentation had evolved over the county's development. The clerk had thought it was a fine idea. Standing at that display, available for any fairgoer to examine, was the discrepancy that Claire had documented, visible, labeled, public, in the county register's own presentation. Whitmore found out about the display at approximately 2 in the afternoon. from someone who came to find him in the livestock area with a look on his face that told him something had gone wrong before the man said a word. Ethan watched Whitmore receive this information from 30 yards away, watched the small stillness that passed over him, the recalibration, the decision about how to respond. Then Whitmore moved through the crowd toward the records display, and his two office men moved with him. Ethan found Clara first. She was standing at the edge of the display area, not at the display itself, just nearby, watching the crowd with the particular quality of attention she had when she was tracking several things at once. "He's coming," Ethan said. "I know," she said. "I saw him arrive." She glanced at Ethan. "Don't stand beside me. Go to where the Peabodys are." He went. He found the Peabodys near the food tables and positioned himself where he could see both the display and Clara, and he waited. Whitmore reached the display. He looked at the survey maps for less than 10 seconds before he understood what he was looking at. Ethan was too far to hear anything, but he could read the body language. Whitmore turning to the register clerk who was staffing the display, something being said, the clerk's uncertain response. Then Whitmore looking around the fairground with the slow, controlled scan of a man identifying a threat. He found Clara. She was standing exactly where Ethan had left her, and she didn't move when Whitmore's gaze found her. She just stood there and looked back at him across the fairground crowd, this woman he had arranged a marriage for as a private joke. This woman the county had categorized and dismissed, and what passed between them across that distance was not dramatic. It was just recognition. He understood finally what he had miscalculated, and she let him see that she knew he understood. He walked toward her. His office men stayed at the display. Ethan moved closer. Not beside her. He was maybe 20 feet to her left, with Martin Peabody just behind him, and Walt Ogren had appeared from somewhere near the livestock area and was standing on the far side of the path. None of them had arranged this. They had just all arrived at the same place at the same time, the way people do when they've been moving in the same direction for long enough. Whitmore stopped a few feet from Clara. His voice, when he spoke, was low and controlled. Not the friendly ease he usually deployed, but something harder underneath it. "This is a mistake," he said. "Whatever you think you've built, it's not what you think it is. I have lawyers who've looked at every contract I've issued in this county, and there is nothing in any of them that doesn't hold up." "Then you won't have anything to worry about when the territorial court examines them," Clara said. Her voice was completely even. "You're going to cause serious harm to a lot of people who depend on this county's lending structure functioning," he said. "Families who need access to capital will find that access restricted because of what you're doing. Have you thought about that?" "I've thought about the families who lost property they legally owned because of what you did," she said. "I've thought about them quite a lot." He looked at her for a moment, really looked at her in a way that was different from the dismissal he'd been practicing since he'd arranged the marriage. Then he said quietly enough that only she and Ethan, close enough now to hear, could make out the words. "I gave you and your husband an arrangement that saved his ranch. You owe me some degree of—" "You gave us an arrangement you thought would humiliate us both," Clara said, "and then we didn't behave the way you expected, and now you're here at a county fair trying to remind me that I should be grateful." She looked at him with the clear, direct quality she had when she'd decided something was true and was simply stating it. "I'm not grateful, Mr. Whitmore. I'm a woman with a commissioner's administrative notice, 7 families' worth of documented evidence, a surveyor's affidavit, and a witness who worked in your office for 4 years. That's what I am." Whitmore said nothing. Behind Clara, Dora Falk had appeared. She'd come with her neighbor and had been somewhere in the fair crowds, and she was now standing perhaps 10 feet back, not saying anything, just present. And beside Dora were the Delaney's, the young couple, who had arrived with the same quiet convergence as everyone else. Whitmore looked at the people around Clara. He looked at the survey display. He looked at the crowd of fairgoers who had begun to sense that something was happening near the records table and were drifting toward it with the fair crowd's instinct for anything more interesting than livestock. He made a calculation. Ethan could see him making it. And then Caleb Whitmore, who had spent 20 years being the most powerful man in Harding County and who had never lost a hand he was dealt because he'd always been holding cards the other players didn't know about, turned and walked away through the crowd without another word. It was not a defeat. Not yet. The courts would determine that over months of process that none of them could fully predict. But it was a moment. The moment when the calculation changed, when the man who had designed their humiliation understood that the thing he'd arranged had not gone the direction he'd intended. Clara watched him go. Her face was composed and gave nothing away to the people now watching. Then she turned and looked at Ethan, and what was in her face in that private half-second before she put the composure back in place was not triumph, not relief. It was something older and quieter than either of those things. The look of someone who has carried a weight long enough to forget what it felt like not to be carrying it, and who can feel for the first time what it might be like to put it down. Ethan looked back at her across the fair crowd and the March sunlight and the accumulated months of what they had built together, and he thought that Caleb Whitmore had been right about one thing, though not the thing he'd intended. The arrangement had made things easier, just not for Whitmore. The weeks after the Frontier Fair were not triumphant. That was the thing nobody talked about when they told stories about people standing up to powerful men. They left out the part that came after. The long, grinding weeks where nothing was resolved, and the powerful man was still powerful, and the process that was supposed to deliver justice moved at the pace of paperwork and court calendars and lawyers who billed by the hour. Whitmore retained 2 attorneys from Cheyenne. They arrived in Dunn's Creek on a Tuesday in early April and took rooms at the hotel and began the methodical work of contesting every element of the commissioner's administrative notice. They were good attorneys, not corrupt, just skilled, which was in some ways more difficult to navigate than corruption because you couldn't simply expose them. You had to outwork them. Clara read their first filing, which the commissioner's office sent her as a matter of process, and spent an evening going through it page by page. Ethan sat across the table and watched her face and learned what he always learned from watching her read something important, that her expressions were small and precise, small compressions around the eyes when she found something she'd anticipated, a slight slowing of the page-turning when she found something she hadn't. "What are they arguing?" he said when she'd finished. 3 things. She set the filing down. First, that the contract language, while complex, is legally defensible and was available for review by all parties before signing. That's true technically, and it's their strongest argument. She touched the second page. Second, that the payment discrepancies are attributable to clerical error rather than intentional fraud, and that Whitmore's office has already begun a voluntary audit to correct any errors identified. She said the word voluntary with a flatness that conveyed what she thought of it. Third, that the deed discrepancy in the Peabody case is a filing error made by a county employee, not a document alteration, and that Whitmore's office has no responsibility for errors in county record keeping. They're blaming the county clerk. A county clerk who no longer works there, she said, a man named Hobart, who retired in 1884 and died in 1887. He's a very convenient explanation. Ethan looked at the filing. Can they make that stick? On the deed, I don't know. The problem is that proving who altered the document requires proving a negative. Pruitt's survey shows the discrepancy, but establishing when the registered copy was changed and by whose hand is harder than I'd like. She was being honest in the way she always was when the situation called for it, without softening. Reed's testimony on the payment records is strong. The memo is strong. The contract pattern across 7 families is strong. The deed is the weakest piece, and Whitmore's lawyers know it. So what do? We find Garfield Pruce, she said. She'd been trying to find him since February. Pruce, the former office manager who had supervised the lending operation during the period of the earliest alterations, had left Whitmore's employ in 1886 and, as far as the public record showed, had left Harding County shortly after. Reed didn't know where he'd gone. The county payroll register showed his last entry in October of 1886, and then nothing. Clara had written to the Territorial Employment Office in Cheyenne, to 2 county offices in neighboring territories, and to the Postal Directory Service in Denver. She'd had no response that amounted to anything. Pruce had not been hiding. He'd simply left, and not left a trail that she could follow from a ranch house in Wyoming. It was Annette Peabody who found him. Annette's sister lived in Fort Collins, across the territorial line in Colorado, and Annette had written to her about the case in the general terms of a woman describing a family difficulty to a relative. Her sister had written back asking questions, and Annette had answered them, and in her third letter she had mentioned the name Garfield Pruess. Her sister had written back within 2 weeks. She knew a Garfield Pruess, or knew of him. He ran a small dry goods operation in Fort Collins. He'd been there since early 1887. Annette brought the letter to Clara on a Thursday morning and stood in the kitchen doorway while Clara read it. "Can you write to your sister?" Clara said, without looking up. "I need his address." She had it within 10 days. She wrote to Pruess herself, not a demanding letter, not an accusatory one, but a precise and factual account of the case, what had been documented, what the court process looked like, and what his testimony, if he was willing to give it, would and would not require of him. She told him honestly that Whitmore's attorneys were constructing a defense that relied on the deed alteration being attributed to county error rather than deliberate fraud, and that his account of the office's practices during the relevant period was the thing most likely to address that argument. She did not threaten him. She did not promise him things she couldn't deliver. She just told him the truth and let him decide what to do with it. He wrote back in 3 weeks. His letter was short, 5 sentences. He said he'd been expecting something like this letter for 2 years. He said he would testify. He said he wanted to do it in writing first, a sworn affidavit, before any in-person appearance, because he had a business now and a life he'd built, and he needed to understand what he was walking into. He said he'd be in Laramie for a supply purchasing trip in late May and could meet with whoever needed to meet with him. Clara read the letter twice. Then she set it down and put her face in her hands, not weeping, not collapsing, just pressing her palms against her eyes for a long moment, in the way that people do when something they've been holding very hard finally gives slightly. Ethan didn't say anything. He just put his hand on the table near hers and left it there, and after a moment she lifted her face and looked at him, and there was no pretense between them, no careful management of what she let him see. "Okay," she said. Her voice was steady. "Okay," he said back. May in Wyoming was the county at its most provisional. The winter gone, but not reliably gone. The grass coming in green in the low places while the high ground was still brown. The light lasting longer each day as though testing whether it was safe to commit. The Wilder Ranch had come through the winter better than the previous 2, partly because Clara had reorganized the hay storage in November in a way that reduced spoilage, and partly because the cattle that remained were the ones Ethan had kept after Clara had gone through the herd records and identified which animals were most likely to have productive years ahead. She'd done this by reading, by asking questions of men who'd been ranching longer than either of them, and by applying to livestock the same systematic attention she applied to everything. She was wrong sometimes. She was right enough times that the difference was visible in the spring numbers. The ranch was not prosperous. They were not going to pretend it was something it wasn't. But it was stable in a way it hadn't been in years, and that stability had a particular quality to it. It was earned stability, built from the inside rather than propped up from outside, and that made it feel different under their feet. Walt Ogren said, one afternoon in May, when he'd come to help Ethan repair the north fence line, that the Wilder Ranch looked better than it had since Ethan's father was running it. He said it as a simple observation, without flattery. Ethan accepted it the same way and didn't say what he was thinking, which was that the improvement had less to do with him than with the woman currently in the house behind them working through a correspondence with the commissioner's office that had been running for 6 weeks. Ogren seemed to read something in the silence anyway. He drove a nail and said, "She's something, your wife." "Yes," Ethan said. "I mean that plain. I know some of what people said about her before. I said some of it, probably, in the way you say things you don't think twice about." He was looking at the fence, not at Ethan. "I'm not proud of that." "She knows what people said." "I imagine she does." Ogren drove another nail. "Does she know it's different now?" "She doesn't need it to be different," Ethan said. "She'd tell you to keep your good opinion and give her the evidence she needs." Ogren almost smiled. "Sounds right." But it was different, and it had been changing since March, since the fair, in ways that moved at their own speed regardless of what Clara needed or didn't need from it. The women in Dunn's Creek who had spoken to her in the particular tone no longer used that tone. It wasn't warmth. That was too much to expect, and Clara herself wouldn't have known what to do with sudden warmth from people who'd spent years cultivating the opposite. But it was the absence of active cruelty, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The men who had called Ethan's marriage Whitmore's joke had stopped saying it, at least in places where it might get back to him. The dry goods clerk, who had always found reasons to make Clara wait longer than necessary at the counter, had stopped doing that too, without explanation. None of these people would have said they'd been wrong. People rarely do, but they changed their behavior, which was what mattered functionally, and Clara moved through Dunn's Creek on the weeks when she came in for the register office, or supplies with the same self-contained directness she'd always had, neither warmer toward the people who'd changed, nor colder, just herself, which was all she'd ever been trying to be. The meeting with Pruess happened in Laramie on the 23rd of May, in the back room of a hotel dining room that the commissioner's representative, a young deputy named Lassiter, who had been assigned to shepherd the case through its evidence-gathering phase, had arranged for the purpose. Pruess was a man in his early 50s who had gone to fat in the comfortable way of someone who'd stopped working physically and started sleeping properly. He had steady eyes and the slight over-formality of manner that Ethan had come to associate with people who had done something they weren't proud of and were working actively to build a life that contradicted it. He shook Clara's hand when they were introduced, which some men in 1888 did, and some didn't, and he held it a beat longer than necessary, the way you hold a hand when a handshake means something beyond its surface function. He testified for 4 hours. He testified to the design of the contract language, that it had been drafted specifically to create the gap between apparent and actual obligation, that this had been discussed explicitly in the office, that Whitmore had approved the structure after reviewing a memo outlining its function. He identified the memo, which Clara produced, as the document he recognized. He testified to the payment recording practices, that lump sum payments in particular were sometimes recorded in a first ledger entry and then adjusted in a subsequent entry made days or weeks later, with the adjustment reducing the credited amount. He described the instruction he had received about this practice and the person who had given it. He testified to the deed alteration. He did not say he had done it himself. What he said was that he had been present in the office on a specific date in the autumn of 1884 when the registered copy of the Peabody deed had been accessed from the county file storage that was maintained during that period in the same building as Whitmore's lending office. He said he had seen the document on the desk of a man he named, a name that was not Whitmore, but was someone who reported directly to Whitmore, and that the document had not been on that desk for any purpose he was ever given an explanation for. He said that 2 days later, having reason to access the same county file, he had compared the document in the file to a copy in the office's own records, and had noticed the boundary language was different. He had not reported this. He said that plainly. He had not reported it. He had told himself it was not his concern. He had worked for the man for another 2 years and then left when the work became something he could not continue to tell himself was separate from what he knew. Deputy Lassiter took everything down. Clara sat beside Ethan across the table from Pruess and asked her questions with the systematic precision that was her defining quality, and when she'd finished she had what she needed, which was not a perfect testimony. Pruess hadn't seen the alteration being made, and Whitmore's attorneys would press that gap. But testimony that placed the document in a specific location at a specific time, in the presence of specific people, for no legitimate purpose. It was the last piece. On the drive back from Laramie, through the long spring evening light that turned the Wyoming grassland gold, and then amber, and then the particular dark blue that came just before true dark, Clara sat beside Ethan on the wagon seat and was quiet for a long time in the way that was different from her working quiet. This was the other kind, the kind that came after, when the thing you'd been driving toward was finally behind you rather than ahead. He didn't push her out of it. He'd learned the difference. After a while, she said, "My father used to say that the hardest part of any job was knowing when it was finished." He glanced at her. She rarely mentioned her parents. Was he a methodical man? Very. She was looking at the road. He was a bookkeeper. He worked for the same firm for 30 years, and he was never the most important person in any room, but he knew every number in the company's history, and when the senior partners had questions about anything more than 5 years back, they came to him. She was quiet for a moment. He died when I was 19. My mother, 6 months later. The firm sent a sympathy card. I'm sorry, Ethan said. It was a long time ago. She said it without self-pity, just as a fact. What I've thought about doing this, his kind of work, the documentation, the records, the pattern finding, I've thought about him more than I expected to. She turned her head and looked at the darkening landscape. He would have found Whitmore's scheme in a week, and nobody would have asked him to. Ethan understood what she was saying, not just about her father, but about the particular cruelty of having a capability that the world consistently directed away from useful purpose, because it couldn't see past the surface of the person carrying it. They'll ask you now, he said. She looked at him. Will they? After this is done? Yes. He held her gaze for a moment before looking back at the road. People have short memories for how they treated someone, but they have long memories for what someone did for them. The families in that room in March, Ogren, the Peabodys, Dora, all of them, they know what you did, and people talk. It'll spread the way things do out here. She didn't say anything to that for a while. Then, I didn't do it to be asked for things afterward. I know that, he said. That's probably part of why they'll ask. The territorial court issued its findings in August. It was not fast and it was not clean, and there were 3 weeks in June when Whitmore's attorneys filed a motion to exclude the Proust testimony on the grounds that his account contained no direct observation of document alteration, only circumstantial presence, and Clara spent those 3 weeks in a focused, grinding anxiety that she managed by working and not sleeping enough, and occasionally being short with Ethan in ways she apologized for afterward with the directness she brought to everything. He accepted the apologies and didn't make more of them than they were. He'd had his own moments during those weeks. A morning when he'd taken his frustration out on a fence post that didn't need to be that thoroughly driven and hurt his hand doing it, which Clara had rapped without comment and without the "I told you so" that he probably deserved. The motion to exclude was denied. Lassiter's office sent word by courier, and Clara read the notice at the kitchen table and put it down and didn't do anything dramatic. She made coffee. She brought 2 cups to the table. She and Ethan sat and drank it, and outside the summer land ran green in every direction farther than you could see. 1 more month, she said. Probably closer to 2. Probably, she agreed. It was 6 weeks. The court findings, when they came, covered 41 pages that neither of them read straight through in a single sitting but worked through together over 3 evenings, passing pages back and forth, Ethan reading and handing, Clara annotating in the margins of her own copy with the pencil she always had. The findings established that Whitmore Lending had engaged in systematic fraudulent practices across a documented period of at least 6 years, including deliberate construction of loan contracts designed to obscure actual borrower obligation, falsification of payment records to reduce credit applied to borrower accounts, and involvement in the alteration of a county-registered property document. The court found sufficient evidence to support fraud charges against Caleb Whitmore personally, and against the former office manager, the name Proust had given in his testimony, who had since relocated to Nevada and would be subject to a separate proceeding. Whitmore's lending operation was ordered suspended pending full audit. All outstanding loans under Whitmore Lending were referred to an independent accounting review to determine correct balances. Families whose accounts showed documented discrepancies were entitled to recalculation and credit for overpayments. The Peabody property's registered deed was ordered corrected to match the Pruitt survey. The foreclosure proceedings against Dora Falk's property were voided. Caleb Whitmore was facing criminal fraud charges in territorial court. His attorneys had already filed for delay. The process would take longer. It always did. But the administrative wall the commissioner had erected held throughout. None of the affected families lost their properties during the proceeding. That was the thing that mattered most immediately and most practically, that the time the court needed to work had not come at the cost of the land and houses and livelihoods of the people who'd already paid enough. Ethan drove out to tell Dora Falk himself. He did it the morning after they received the findings, while the dew was still on the grass and the air had the particular quality of early Wyoming August mornings, when summer is warm enough but not yet finished with the memory of how cold it was. Dora was in her yard when he arrived, doing exactly what she'd been doing the first time he'd come to see her, Ordinary morning work, the kind that continues regardless of what else is happening, because the ordinary work is also what holds a life together. She read the relevant page he handed her. She read it twice. Then she handed it back to him and looked out at her land, the land her husband had spent his working life building something on, the land she'd been managing alone since his death, the land she'd nearly lost to numbers that had been quietly falsified in a ledger book by people who counted on her not knowing enough to fight back. "Is it over?" she said. "For your property, yes," he said. "For the court process, not entirely. Whitmore will keep fighting the criminal charges for a while. But your deed is clear. The foreclosure is voided. The audit will calculate what you actually owe on the correct terms." She nodded slowly. "Dora," he said, "you're all right." She looked at him, and what was on her face was not the relief he'd expected. It was something more complicated, grief and relief together, the particular mixture of someone who has survived something their partner didn't get to see resolved. She was thinking about her husband. He could see it. "He should have known," she said. "He died not knowing." "He knew you would hold the land," Ethan said. And he believed it, because he'd seen the biscuit tin with the organized papers, the years of careful record-keeping that a woman had done, because some part of her was always preparing for the fight she didn't know how to start yet. Her husband had seen who she was. He'd left her the farm because he trusted her with it. Dora pressed her lips together and looked away for a moment across her fields, and when she looked back, she was composed in the way that people are composed when they've decided what to do with what they feel. "Tell Clara thank you," she said. "I don't have words that are big enough. Tell her that." "Tell her yourself," Ethan said. "Come to dinner Sunday. Everyone is coming." The dinner was Clara's idea, which surprised him because she was not someone who naturally reached for the celebratory gesture. But she'd said, the evening they received the findings, that the families who had been in this together needed to be in the same room when it was over, the same way they'd been in the same room when it began. That it mattered for it to be acknowledged together rather than separately, because what had happened was a collective thing, not just a collection of individual stories. She spent 2 days preparing for it with the same systematic attention she brought to everything, which produced results that were good but not elegant. The food was plentiful and well-made but not fancy. The tables pulled from wherever they existed in the house, set up with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who cared about function over presentation. Annette Peabody brought 2 pies. Ogren's wife brought bread. Dora brought a jar of preserved plums from the previous autumn, which she set in the middle of the table like a declaration. They were 11 adults and 6 children crowded into the Wilder ranch house and spilling onto the porch when the evening was warm enough for it, which it was, the August heat gentle and the light lasting long. The children ran in the yard and the adults ate and talked, and the conversation moved in the way that conversations do when people have been through something together that they're still processing, touching the serious things and then pulling back to the ordinary things and then returning, because the serious things needed air, but so did the ordinary things, and right now the ordinary things felt particularly precious. At some point in the evening, with the plates half cleared and the second round of coffee made, Martin Peabody said something that opened a different kind of conversation. He said, without particular preface, that he'd been thinking about what would have happened to all of them if Clara hadn't started looking at the public records 8 months before any of them knew there was a problem to look at. The table got a little quieter, the kind of quiet that leans in. "We'd have lost the ranch," Walt Ogren said, flat and simple. "I was 6 months from not being able to make payments on the correct amount. On the inflated amount, I was already underwater." "We were going to sell," young Delaney said. His wife reached across and put her hand over his on the table, without drama, just there. "We'd already talked about it. Take what we could get, move on. I thought it was our own failure." He looked at the table for a moment. "I was 26 years old, and I thought I'd failed, and I didn't even know there was anyone else feeling the same thing, because we were all sitting alone with it." The table was quiet enough now that you could hear the children in the yard. Clara, who had been in and out of the room through the evening in the way of the person who'd cooked the meal, was standing in the kitchen doorway. Ethan looked at her, and she was looking at Delaney with an expression that was stripped of its usual careful management. Not sentimentality, but the thing underneath sentimentality. The real thing, which was that she understood isolation down to the bone, and had understood it for a long time. You didn't fail, she said. The structure was designed to make you feel like you had. I know that now, Delaney said. Knowing it doesn't entirely fix how it felt. No, Clara said. It doesn't. She came into the room and sat down at her own table, which she'd been not quite doing all evening, the half-host's habit of staying at the edge. It'll feel like your failure for longer than it should. That's part of the damage. She looked around the table, at all of them, the people who'd been in her kitchen in March with their fear and their questions and their carefully suppressed anger, who were here now in August with their land still under their feet. But you weren't alone. You were never alone. You just didn't know about each other. Annette Peabody looked at her. Annette had the quality that some people develop after a long time paying close attention to things. She saw what was in front of her and didn't dress it up. You were alone, she said, not cruelly, just observationally. When you started, you didn't have any of us yet. Clara accepted this without deflecting. Yes. Why did you start? Annette asked. Before any of us knew to help you. Before you had anything. Why? Clara looked at the table for a moment. It was not a question she'd been asked directly before, and she took it seriously the way she took everything serious, actually thinking, not reaching for an easy answer. Because the numbers didn't add up, she said. And when numbers don't add up, there's a reason, and I couldn't unknow that I'd seen it. She looked at her hands. And I had time, which most of you didn't have. I wasn't running a farm or raising children. I was a woman alone in a small house with my books and my notebooks and a cousin who didn't want me at her table, and I had nothing but time to look at things that other people were too tired and too busy to look at. She paused. It wasn't courage. It was circumstance and stubbornness, and the particular anger of someone who has spent her whole life being told she doesn't see clearly. Hector Vance, who had been mostly quiet all evening, the same way he'd been mostly quiet at the March meeting, said from his end of the table, "You see clearer than anyone I've ever met." Clara looked at him. He said it without performance, without the excess warmth that would have made it feel like a gift rather than a statement of observed fact. She absorbed it the same way. "I see what I look at," she said. "I looked at this, Mes." After the guests had gone and the children had been collected and the wagons had rolled out down the dark road and the ranch was quiet again, Ethan and Clara cleaned up the remnants of the dinner together in the way they'd developed over the months. No assigned tasks, just the two of them moving around the kitchen in the practiced near choreography of people who have shared a space long enough to know where the other person is going without looking. When the table was cleared and the dishes done, and the kitchen was back to its ordinary configuration, Clara sat down in the chair by the window that was no longer cold because it was August, and sat there with her hands in her lap, not doing anything, which was unusual enough that Ethan stopped and looked at her. She was looking at the window, the dark outside and the lamp-reflected version of the room that the glass made, so that you could see both the darkness and the room's interior at the same time. "What are you thinking?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking about what Annette asked me." He got the other chair and sat near her, not across the table, just near. "What about it?" "I gave her the honest answer," Clara said. "About why I started. But there's a part of the honest answer I didn't say." She was still looking at the window. "When I moved to Harding County, I told myself I would be useful, that I would find a way to be useful that didn't depend on anyone's approval of how I looked or who they thought I was. I told myself that because I needed something to hold on to, and it was something that was mine regardless of what anyone else decided." She turned from the window and looked at him. "I was doing this, the records, the investigation, for 11 months before we married, alone, with no one to tell it to. And the work was real and it was right, but there was a particular—" She stopped, chose the word carefully. "Hollowness to doing something that mattered and having no one to hand it to." Ethan looked at her. He thought about her in that small foreman's quarters house, going to the county register alone, writing her careful letters, filling composition notebooks with evidence of a crime that the rest of the county couldn't see, doing the work that needed doing with no expectation that anyone would notice. "That Saturday in March," he said, "when everyone was in this kitchen." "Yes," she said, "that was—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. He understood. All those months of alone work and then a room full of people who were listening. "You know," he said, I've been thinking about something Whitmore said. At the fair. He looked at the table. He said the arrangement he gave us saved my ranch. He did say that. He wasn't wrong, technically. Ethan turned the thought over. The debt would have forced a sale by last winter. Without the restructuring, I lose the land. He looked up at her. What I've been trying to figure out how to say is that when he made that arrangement, he thought he was giving me a burden, a woman nobody wanted, as a condition of a deal he expected to watch fail. He held her gaze. And what he actually did was hand me the only person capable of doing what you did. He handed me the case that brought him down, and he put it in my kitchen and called it a joke. Clara looked at him for a moment. The lamp between them made the same shadows it had been making since their first winter, the kitchen that had become genuinely theirs over the months of all of this. He thought my value was in being unwanted, she said. Yes, and he was wrong about my value. He was catastrophically wrong about your value, Ethan said, and he meant it without any performance of it, just as the plainest available fact. She looked at him for a long moment, then she said, I want to say something and I need you to hear it as what it is, not more or less. All right. I spent a long time deciding that I didn't need to be wanted, she said, by the town, by the people who should have been family to me, by anyone. I decided that needing to be wanted was the thing that made people bend themselves into shapes they couldn't sustain, so I didn't bend. I stayed what I was, and I did the work, and I told myself that was enough. She was looking directly at him, the door fully open, no careful management. I think I was mostly right about that. I think it kept me whole when other things would have broken me. But I also think... She paused. I think I was so committed to not needing it that I didn't leave room to want it, what you'd actually want, if you let yourself. She looked at her hands. This is harder to say than contract law. Ethan didn't say anything. He waited. I would not go back, she said, to before the marriage, to before this year, this work, this house, and the mess of all of it, and you arguing with me about when to bring in Ogren, and the 3 times I was wrong about things, and the one time you drove the fence post too hard and hurt your hand being foolish. She looked at him, and there was something that was not quite a smile, but was the thing that existed just underneath the smile, the thing that preceded it. I wouldn't go back to the quieter and simpler version where I was alone in that house with my notebooks. I would rather have had all of this. He let that settle where it needed to settle. Then he said, Good, because I would have had strong feelings about you going back. She did smile then. It was not a frequent occurrence, and it never stopped being something that reorganized the room a little when it happened. I know, she said. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. She let him, and her hand in his was warm and had the work-roughened quality that both their hands had, the honest marks of what their life was. And neither of them said anything else for a while because there was nothing else that particularly needed saying. Outside, the August dark was full and warm, and the Wyoming land ran out in every direction from the ranch house. The pastures that were green now, the fence lines that held, the north acres that would be ready for expanded herd next spring if the weather cooperated, and sometimes it did. The land that had been Ethan's father's, and then Ethan's, and was now, in the way that real things become real, theirs. Not a symbol, not a triumph, just land, with good years and bad years and work that never fully ended, and the particular satisfaction of work that meant something. In Dunn's Creek, the court process would continue through the fall. Whitmore's criminal case would drag into the following year, as these things did, and his attorneys would find delays and file motions, and the territorial court would move at its own pace. But the lending operation stayed suspended. The audit ran through the accounts of every family who had borrowed from Whitmore Lending, and the recalculations produced credits and corrections, and in 3 cases revealed overpayments large enough to constitute meaningful restitution. The Peabody deed was corrected and refiled, and the 6 acres that had existed only on paper for 4 years went back to where they belonged. Dora Falk's final account, calculated on the correct terms with all documented overpayments credited, showed that she had in fact satisfied her loan 14 months prior. The land was hers, unencumbered, and had been for over a year. Amos Reed left Whitmore's employ the day the court findings were issued. He spent several difficult months because his reputation in Harding County was complicated by his association with the office. But he was a precise and reliable man with skills that were genuinely useful. And by the following spring, he was keeping books for 3 different businesses in Dunn's Creek. He was not a brave man, as he'd said himself in the library room in February. But he'd done the brave thing when the door was in front of him, and sometimes that's all courage is, finding the door and going through it, even though your hands are shaking. Garfield Pruis gave his testimony and went back to his dry goods business in Fort Collins, and was not a presence in Harding County after that. His separate legal situation was handled in Colorado over the following year, in a process Clara followed through the territorial newspapers but did not participate in. She had enough on her plate. There's a thing that happens with people who have been underestimated for a long time. It is not that the underestimation stops mattering. It leaves marks, the way any sustained pressure leaves marks, and the marks don't disappear just because the pressure does. What changes is something else. What changes is the internal measurement, the one you use to take your own stock. Clara had been taking her stock by other people's measurements for long enough that she'd almost stopped noticing she was doing it. Almost. The voice that said, "You are too much, you are not enough, you are the wrong shape for the life you want." That voice had been with her so long it had started to sound like her own thinking rather than something external that had been imposed on her. It didn't disappear after the court findings. She would not tell you it disappeared. What she would tell you, if she was being precise about it, which she always was that it got quieter. Not silenced, quieter. And other things got louder in proportion. The work, the results of the work, the specific memories of specific moments when something she had built with her own mind and her own sustained attention had mattered in ways she could measure. The 7 families that still had their land. Dora Falk's expression when she was told the land was hers. The young Delaney husband saying he'd thought it was his own failure and what it had meant to tell him it wasn't. Those things were louder now. They were hers, and they were true, and nobody could revise them. The town did not throw a celebration for Clara Beaumont Wilder. That was not how the town worked, and she wouldn't have known what to do with a celebration anyway. What happened instead was slower and more real. A gradual reorientation, the kind that towns do when something has shifted in the underlying order of things, and they're adjusting to account for it without fully acknowledging the adjustment. People came to her with questions. That was the main way it showed. Not immediately, and not with fanfare. At first, just the families who'd been through the process with her, who had specific practical questions about the audit or the account corrections or what the court findings meant for their particular situation. Then others, people adjacent to the case who'd heard there was someone who understood contracts and county records and how to document a discrepancy. Then people with problems that had nothing to do with Whitmore, a woman whose deceased husband's will was being contested by a relative, a farmer trying to understand the terms of a water rights agreement, a young man who'd signed something he didn't fully understand and needed to know what it actually said. She helped them. She told each one what she could determine from the documents and where the limits of her knowledge were and who they'd need to speak to if the situation required legal representation. She kept notes on each one because she kept notes on everything, and she didn't charge for it, which produced a recurring conversation with Ethan where she said it wasn't something you charged for, and he said that the work had value, and she said she knew it had value, and he said that was exactly why you charged for it, and they went around on this with the comfortable friction of 2 people who had well-established positions on a long-running disagreement. By the second autumn, she was charging for it, a small amount, carefully calibrated to what people could afford, which in some cases was nothing, and in those cases she waived it without discussion. She kept the money in a separate account in a different ledger from the ranch finances, which Ethan respected because he understood the importance of a thing that was hers, specifically hers, not blended into the joint account of their shared life. The ranch was theirs, jointly and genuinely. The work she did with documents and records and the quiet, desperate problems of people who didn't know where else to take them, that was hers. She'd earned it differently than she'd earned anything else in her life, and she held it that way. One afternoon in the 2nd October, Ethan came in from the south pasture to find Clara at the table with her notebooks, and across from her a woman he didn't recognize, 40-ish, clearly from out of the county, with the look of someone who had traveled some distance with a specific purpose. He made himself useful elsewhere and didn't intrude. An hour later, the woman left, and Clara sat at the table looking at her notes. "Who is that?" Ethan said. "A woman from Carter County," Clara said. "Her family has a situation with a land agent that sounds familiar. She heard about our case from someone who heard from someone." She looked at her notes. "It's complicated. I need to read the documents she brought before I can say anything useful." "Carter County is 60 miles, Ethan said. "Yes," Clara said. "It is." He looked at his wife. This woman who had arrived at his ranch with 2 trunks and a cast iron skillet and had changed everything, not by being extraordinary in the way of stories, not by being flawless or fearless or any of the things the stories made people out to be, but by being stubborn and precise and genuinely angry about injustice and willing to do the work when no one was watching and no one was going to thank her for it. By being more than the category the world had assigned her to, not by transcending the category, but by simply being too real and too specific and too thoroughly herself for the category to hold her. "You're going to help her," he said. "I'm going to look at the documents," she said. "Then I'll know if I can help her." She looked up. "Don't get ahead of the evidence, Ethan." "Right," he said. He went back to the barn and left her to it, and the afternoon light came through the window of the ranch house kitchen and fell across the table and the notebooks and the woman at the center of them. And outside the Wyoming land went on in every direction. And the story that nobody had expected when it started was still going, still adding itself up, still becoming what it was. Not a fairy tale and not a tragedy, but something more durable than either. Something true.